What occurs if there is no map of the road you are driving? When the gasoline gauge defies physics and your GPS takes you into a void where time goes backwards. We're delving into 11 recorded tales of travelers disappearing from the world's most haunted desert roadways tonight on Verified Fears. The dead continue to patrol interminable lengths of tarmac beneath starless skies, as phantom hitchhikers hop into moving vehicles. You are a member of the Verified Fears family if you made it through all 11 stories. We're just getting started with the most unsettling real horror stories on the planet, so click the subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Now let's go to our first tale. After spending a weekend camping in Joshua Tree National Park, the Martinez family was on their way back to Los Angeles in the summer of 2019. It was intended to be a straightforward 3-hour drive back on well-known roadways, but what transpired next would cause them to lose all sense of reality and start doubting everything they believed to be true about the roads they had traversed. Melissa was driving their Honda Pilot while her husband Miguel sat in the passenger seat, and their 2 children, 9-year-old Josh and 12-year-old Emma, slept in the rear. This was a path they had traveled dozens of times. Highway 62 to Interstate 10 West, then linking up with Nevada's notorious alien highway, Route 375. Miguel's new dashboard GPS system, a top-of-the-line Garmin device he had installed the week prior, and that included satellite connectivity and real-time traffic updates, was what set this journey apart. The issue started at 11:30 p.m. as they got close to the Nevada border. Miguel saw that there was unusual traffic ahead on their typical GPS route. For the following 40 meters, a huge red line indicates that traffic has stopped, but the new Garmin device was recommending a different path that would save them over 2 hours. The GPS indicated that the proposed route was Desert Bypass 375A, a well-signposted roadway that branched off Route 375. Show. The unit displayed this road as a valid state highway with a 65 mph speed limit, even though Miguel had never heard of it. As they got closer to what should have been a desert, Melissa squinted at the GPS screen and exclaimed, "I've never seen this road before." But there it was. A flawlessly paved 2-lane highway with new yellow lines and reflective markers precisely where the GPS said it should be. When they turned onto the enigmatic highway, everything appeared normal for the first few minutes, including the road surface and the mile markers that started with DB001. The road even had an official Nevada Department of Transportation sign that read, Desert Bypass 375A Las Vegas, 127 miles. DB01 had changed to DB0 Revu, then DB999, as if they were traveling in reverse through some impossible numbering system. But Miguel noticed something strange about the mile markers. They were counting backwards, smooth, well-maintained, and totally free of other traffic. The kids were still asleep, and Melissa was relieved to avoid the traffic their old GPS had warned about. Not wishing to disturb the kids, Miguel muttered, "Melissa, check the fuel gauge. It was half full when they got into the bypass, but now it reads full." They had been on this peculiar route for more than an hour. They had more fuel than they had at the beginning, though. Nor was the odometer moving. At precisely 127,463 miles, the same distance they had seen when they first pulled onto the bypass, it stayed motionless. The GPS kept announcing their progress with a smile, saying they were on great time and would reach Las Vegas before the scheduled time. However, the anticipated arrival time kept shifting in ways that were impossible to predict. Initially, it revealed 1:15 a. M 12:45 a.m., M at 11:55 p.m., as though they were going back in time itself. This absurdity was confirmed by the GPS display's timestamp, which indicated that it was 10:47 p.m., almost an hour before they had crossed the street. To inform her sister in Las Vegas that they were running ahead of schedule, Melissa attempted to call her. However, there was no service on her cell phone. Only messages that typically showed up in dead zones, not even emergency calls. The battery level was alternating between 67% and 73% every few seconds, and the phone just showed no service area in a font she had never seen before. They passed the same unique rock formation 4 times after what seemed like 3 hours of travel. It was a tall red sandstone pillar that Miguel had previously photographed due to its unusual shape. The mile marker next to it read DB 500 every time they went by it, as though they were stuck in a loop of some sort. Despite the increasing stress in the car, the youngsters slept abnormally, their breathing coordinated in a way that was almost mechanical. Melissa responded, "We need to turn around," in a trembling voice. However, the steering wheel refused to react when she attempted a U-turn. As though it had a consciousness of its own, the automobile kept driving straight down the interminable highway. The brake lever dropped to the ground. The gear change was locked in drive, and they continued to go at full speed. They were traveling in their own car, on a route that went against all of their knowledge of geography and physics. As if the device had been replaced by something attempting to mimic the original, the GPS started giving directions in a voice that wasn't exactly the same as before, slightly different in pitch and tempo. Proceed straight on Desert Bypass 375A for 500 feet. You're on your way. However, the screen displayed an infinite green line that extended into digital infinity with no destination marked. Melissa observed something even more unsettling as dawn drew near, even if the timestamp continued to suggest it was the middle of the night. The road signs they saw promoted companies that were either non-existent or impossible. The next exit is Desert Pete's 24-hour eatery. Quantum Fuel Station was founded in 2008 and offers premium fuel from refineries of the future. As though the side road ended at the edge of reality, the exits themselves led to complete darkness. They finally saw a familiar sight ahead, after driving for what their internal clocks indicated was about 6 hours. The Las Vegas welcome sign. However, when they got closer, Melissa became aware that they were coming from the incorrect way. They should have been coming from the north, but instead they were coming from the east, from the direction of Arizona, into the city. They had somehow driven absolutely straight and made a full round according to their route. Their autos. Systems went back to normal as soon as they left the city boundaries of Las Vegas. The gasoline gauge decreased to its proper level. Their cell phone popped with dozens of missed calls and messages as the odometer started to move again. With an audible click, the timestamp updated itself to display the accurate time, 6:23 a.m. Exactly 7 hours had been lost. Later that day, Miguel looked over the GPS history, but Desert Bypass 375A was not included. From their campground to Las Vegas, the path they had followed seemed to be a straight line with no deviations. After hours of driving, they saw nothing but empty desert on satellite photography, and the Nevada Department of Transportation had no records of any bypass roads off Route 375. But their daughter Emma's awakening was the most disturbing detail. Rising as they entered their driveway. When they asked her what she meant, she only said, "The road was alive and it was taking us somewhere we weren't supposed to go, but we weren't ready yet, so it let us leave." "Mom," she murmured drowsily, "I had the weirdest dream. I dreamed we were driving on a road that was driving us." Let's move on to our second story. The Martinez family still stays away from Route 375 completely, and Miguel never uses GPS navigation again, sticking to roads he can find on paper maps. Roads he knows existed yesterday and will still exist tomorrow. An experienced long-haul truck driver named James was making his daily run from Phoenix to James was driving his Kenworth T680, towing a fully loaded trailer of auto parts, when he noticed a figure standing next to mile marker 13 at around 2:30 a.m. He had been driving this route for more than 15 years, hauling everything from electronics to construction materials, and he took pride in knowing every mile marker, rest stop, and peculiarity of the highway. What happened that night would turn his most familiar route into a nightmare that still haunts him to this day. The figure, a young woman in her 20s with a small suitcase and a white sundress, completely out of place attire for the almost freezing desert night, was visible in his headlights. She had her thumb out and was staring straight at his approaching truck with a look of desperate hope. James had a strict policy regarding hitchhikers and never picked them up in his 15 years of trucking. But something about this woman, perhaps the fact that she was alone in the middle of nowhere at almost 3 a.m, or perhaps the way she appeared to be shivering in that thin dress, made him change his mind. Company regulations forbade it, and the liability concerns alone kept him focused on his cargo rather than stranded travelers. Although he had seen her in his mirrors moments earlier, she couldn't have traveled that distance so quickly, especially not in the delicate sandals he could now see she was wearing. James, however, found himself slowing down and pulling over about 50 yards past the mile marker. He set his air brakes and got out of the cab, expecting to talk to the woman through his passenger window about calling for proper roadside assistance. Yet, when he looked back toward mile marker 13, the woman was already standing beside his passenger door. She spoke loudly in spite of the desert wind. "Thank you so much for stopping," adding, "I've been waiting here for so long." Her hairstyle was a perfect buffant, and when James looked at her more closely, everything seemed a little strange. Her accent was clearly from the 1960s, the kind of carefully enunciated speech patterns you heard in old movies, with elongated vowels and precise consonants that no one used anymore. That appeared to have been set in a beauty salon earlier that day, and her makeup was perfect, even though she had allegedly stood in the desert wind for hours. James helped her up into the cab against his better judgment and 15 years of company policy, and she settled into the seat with practiced ease, folding both of her hands over her small vintage suitcase, which was on her lap. Leather with brass hardware and travel labels from establishments that James was quite certain had not been around for decades, such as Route 66 Diner and Desert Springs Motor Lodge. "Where are you going?" As he got back into the driver's seat and let go of the air brakes, James questioned. The woman smiled but didn't respond right away, instead appearing to be fascinatedly examining the cab's interior. "Just up the road a piece," she finally said, using an expression James hadn't heard since his grandmother was alive. "You'll know when we get there." Her response made James uneasy, but he was already determined to help her. Her eyes lingered on the GPS unit, the satellite radio, and the digital dashboard displays with what appeared to be genuine confusion. Additionally, the highway was empty in both directions, so he thought he could drop her off at the next truck stop, which was about 30 miles ahead near Baker, California. The woman started talking about her trip as they drove, mentioning that she regularly traveled from Los Angeles to visit her sister in Las Vegas, but the information she gave didn't add up. She mentioned gas prices that were decades old, that she stopped at roadside diners that James knew had been demolished years ago, and made references to 1960s movie stars and current affairs as though they were happening today. At one point, she said, "The new Elvis picture is wonderful. Have you seen it?" Clam Bake had just opened at the drive-in near Barstow, and James realized she was referring to a 1967 film. More than 50 years ago. She stared at him in real bewilderment and murmured, "Oh no, honey," as he gently pointed out that Elvis Presley had been dead for decades. "Yesterday, I only heard him on the radio. Even though the heater was operating at full capacity, the temperature inside the cab started to dramatically decrease. James noticed that his breath was creating tiny clouds, and frost was starting to develop within the windows." The woman sat contentedly in her flimsy summer dress, seemingly oblivious to the cold, while James shivered and reached for his bulky jacket. After driving for about 20 miles, James saw something strange in his rearview mirror, in the red radiance of his tail lights right behind them. It wasn't exactly right, but he could see the woman's reflection. Instead of the white sundress, he could see with his own eyes she seemed to be dressed differently in the glass, sporting a dark coat and hat. The woman sitting next to him looked calm and collected, but her reflection was also making frantic gestures as though to warn him of something. She said, "You're a kind man for stopping," ending the long period of stillness between them. Her voice had changed tone. "Most people just drive right past mile marker 13 these days. They say it's unlucky, you know. They say terrible things have happened there." Sadder, more aloof, as though she were speaking from a great distance. James experienced a chill that was unrelated to the temperature change. Even though he didn't want to know the answer, he inquired, "What kind of terrible things?" For the first time since she had climbed into the truck, the woman turned to face him. James also noticed that her eyes resembled an animal's eyes in the way they reflected the dashboard lights. An artificial silvery sheen that rendered his instinctive terror makes the gut tighten. On Valentine's Day, February 14th, 1967, she was hitching to see her boyfriend in Las Vegas with the intention of surprising him with a marriage proposal, but she never made it. A young woman died there, she murmured softly. When she continued, the temperature in the cab continued to drop, and James realized he could no longer feel his fingers on the steering wheel. Her name was Linda Sue Morrison, and as she spoke, James felt his blood turn to ice. She was 23 years old, had spent her entire life in the desert, and they didn't find her body for 3 days. She was carrying a small suitcase with her engagement ring inside, and she was wearing a white sundress that her mother had made for her. She lifted the old suitcase on her lap and grinned pitifully, and James realized that she had been trying to get to Las Vegas for the past 54 years, taking rides from nice truckers like you. "You need to let me out here," Linda Sue said, her voice now barely a whisper, as he stopped breathing and his hands were frozen to the steering wheel. The woman's reflection in his rearview mirror was now pointing urgently ahead, and James could see what she was pointing at. A quarter of a mile up the road, the red and blue flashing lights of a police car were visible, and beyond that, the twisted wreckage of what appeared to be a serious accident. The truck started to slow down on its own, the air brakes automatically, engaging as they got closer to the accident scene, and as the truck came to a complete stop, Linda Sue opened the passenger door and got down with the same elegant ease she had displayed when getting in. "This is where I get off." James tried to talk, tried to ask questions, but his voice had completely vanished. "Thank you for the ride," she said, standing next to the truck for a bit, staring up at James with a look of unending misery. "And don't worry about what you'll tell them," she said. "They will comprehend." As soon as she shut the door, the cab's temperature stabilized, and James discovered he could once more move and breathe. A state trooper walked up to his driver's side window and tapped on the glass with his flashlight, and James rolled down the window, still trembling from his encounter, but Linda Sue was nowhere to be found. No footprints in the sand, no sign that anyone had ever been in his truck. "Are you all right, driver? We received a call approximately 15 minutes ago," the policeman inquired. "When we arrived, there was no one there, despite someone reporting seeing a truck stopped at mile marker 13 with its hazard lights blinking. We have been trying to find you." James stumbled out an admission regarding the trooper's face darkened as James described Linda Sue in detail, and after he finished, the officer remained silent for a while before taking a battered notebook out of his shirt pocket. "Driver, I've been working the stretch of highway for 12 years. The trooper said slowly, adding, "And you're the 14th trucker who's reported picking up that exact same." The officer went through several pages of notes, and each one described the woman at mile marker 13 in the same way. White sundress, vintage suitcase, 1960s accent, talking about Elvis as if he were still alive. The first report was from 1987. The trooper closed his notebook and turned to face James after a trucker named Bill Henderson called it in and detailed her, down to the color of her nail polish. "Here's what I'm going to tell you, and then we're both going to forget this conversation ever happened. 20 yards past mile marker 13, a small cross is hidden in the sagebrush, marking the location of Linda Sue Morrison's death on Valentine's Day, 1967. She was hitchhiking to Las Vegas to pop the question to her boyfriend, but she never made it. James never again drove Interstate 15 through the Mojave, requesting permanent reassignment to routes that kept him in the eastern United States. He never talked about what happened that night until he retired 5 years later. But occasionally, on chilly February nights when the wind is howling outside his Phoenix home, James claims he can still smell the faint scent of the place, and every trucker who has ever picked her up says she's still trying to get there. Smell of 1960s perfume, and hear a young woman's voice in the distance saying, "I appreciate you stopping. I've spent so much time waiting here." Let's go on to our next tale. In the fall of 2018, veteran long-haul truck driver Mason was traveling down Route 191, a desolate section of the highway that passes through some of the most Mason had been driving this route for more than 20 years. And like most truckers, he relied heavily on his CB radio for company during the long, lonely hours between truck stops. What began as ordinary conversation on Channel 19 would turn into an encounter that still haunts him today and has made him reevaluate everything he believed to be true about the voices that travel the airwaves. On this particular night, at approximately 11:45 p.m., Mason's Peterbilt 379 was fitted with a top-of-the-line Cobra 29 LXCB radio, the same model he had been using for almost 10 years, and it had performed admirably through innumerable trips across the nation, picking up trucker chatter from distances that occasionally surprised even Mason. A man's voice, speaking in the characteristic cadence of an experienced driver, came through on Channel 19, the standard highway frequency that truckers use for eastbound and westbound travel. But something about the transmission quality was off. The signal was crystal clear, clearer than most local transmissions, but it had an odd echo to it, as if the transmission wasn't quite right. Mason was about 40 miles south of the Utah border when his CB started picking up transmissions that didn't sound quite right. Breaker 1N. This is Desert Ghost eastbound at mile marker 47. The voice crackled through the speaker. Be advised, you got major construction ahead, boys. The speaker was speaking from inside a large empty space, warning about road conditions ahead and about construction near mile marker 47. However, Mason checked his atlas and saw that there was no construction scheduled for that area. Mason keyed his microphone to answer, seeking clarification on the construction, but got no response. He tried multiple times over the next few minutes, but Desert Ghost had apparently moved out of range. The voice used proper CB protocol and trucker terminology, but something about the phrasing sounded out of date, like the kind of language drivers used back in the 1970s and 80s. The road was in perfect condition, with no indications of any recent or planned construction work, and when Mason arrived at mile marker 47 approximately 20 minutes later, there was no construction at all, just an empty highway that stretched endlessly through the desert night. An hour later, as Mason approached the region known locally as the Stretch, a particularly remote 15 mi section where cell phone coverage was non-existent and CB signals were usually weak, his radio exploded with activity. One driver complaining about diesel prices decades out of date, another talking about filling up for less than $1 a gallon at that new truck stop near Flagstaff, and several voices coming through on different channels, all favorite, at once, creating a cacophony of overlapping transmissions that shouldn't have been even possible with the radio's channel selection. A female voice with a faint southern accent said, "You guys need to be real careful around mile marker 52. Another voice was talking about CB equipment that hadn't been produced since the early 1980s, mentioning models and features that Mason had heard about in years but had remembered from his early trucking days. This is Midnight Rider westbound on Route 191. The transmission was followed by multiple responses from other drivers, all of whom expressed condolences and shared similar stories about dangerous spots along the highway. Mason found himself drawn into the conversations, despite the increasingly unsettling feeling that something wasn't right about these transmissions. Jackknifed his rig while attempting to avoid something in the road, but he never figured out what he was trying to miss. He lost a good friend there about 6 months ago. A new voice came over the breakers for that Peterbilt heading north past mile marker 50, and Mason's blood ran cold. Voices were talking about routes and truck stops with intimate knowledge, mentioning details about road conditions and local landmarks that only someone who had driven these highways for years would know, but they were also referencing events and places that didn't exist anymore. You got your ears on, driver? This is Iron Eagle, and I have some information you need to hear. Mason quickly grabbed his microphone, his hands trembling a little as he keyed the transmitter. The voice was describing his exact truck and location, but he hadn't communicated his position to anyone. This is Mason northbound in the "You need to know something about the stretch you're driving through, Mason." Iron Eagle's voice resounded more clearly than any CB transmission Mason had ever heard. Go ahead, Iron Eagle. There was a long silence, during which static seemed to pulse in an almost rhythmic pattern. This ain't just highway, son. Mason's mouth went dry as he took in what Iron Eagle was telling him. What do you mean, what's coming? Every voice you're hearing tonight belongs to someone who died on this road, and they're all trying to warn you about what's coming. This is where drivers come to rest when they can't find their way home. He asked, scarcely raising his voice over Iron Eagle replied, That's where the trouble is. Something's been waiting there for a long time. Mile marker 52. Just like Midnight Rider said. As if on cue, several voices started to speak on various channels, warning Mason about mile marker 52. They described a dark figure that would appear in the headlights, causing drivers to swerve violently to avoid it. Something that makes drivers see things that aren't there and swerve into things that are. We've all lost friends there, and we're still trying to keep others from joining us. The voices, speaking with the authority of experience, described the phenomenon in detail and offered advice on how to survive the encounter. "When you see it, don't swerve," said a voice identifying itself as Big Jim. "What looked like a person?" "In the road," the voices said, "but there was never anyone there, and the sudden maneuver would send trucks rolling or jackknifing into the desert. I'm sure your instincts will tell me. Keep your truck straight and true, and don't let whatever you see in those headlights make you panic." "The thing feeds on fear," said another voice, this one identifying itself as Phantom Freight. "You should avoid hitting what appears to be a human, but trust me, there isn't anybody there. It seems more genuine the more terrified you are. According to some drivers, it resembles a woman wearing a white dress. Others notice a man dressed for work. However, it consistently appears to be about to be struck while standing directly in the middle of your lane." While Mason gripped the steering wheel and watched his odometer clock down the miles to the dreaded mile marker 52, his hands were perspiring. The CB's voices persisted in their warnings, recounting the experiences of drivers who had come into contact with the figure and detailing the fallout from collisions that had happened there. The spectral truckers claimed that the phenomenon had been occurring for decades, adding their voices to the ghostly CB chatter that alerted future passengers and taking the lives of drivers on a regular basis. "Do you recall Mason?" The voice of Iron Eagle broke through the other messages. "We ignored the warnings, which is why we are all here. Don't become one of us because of fear." Something about the road ahead was lit by Mason's headlights as he got closer to mile marker 52. As the voices had explained, there was a figure in the middle of his lane, well positioned to make him make an evasive move. The apparition seemed like a middle-aged man in a work clothes, standing motionless with his arms by his sides and looking calmly and resignedly at the approaching truck. Mason's eyes told him that a solid, three-dimensional person was going to be crushed beneath his wheels, and every instinct in his body begged him to swerve to prevent it. The figure appeared to have texture and detail in its clothing, and it cast shadows in his headlights, giving the impression that it was quite genuine. However, Mason recalled the ghostly trucker's warnings and made himself stay on course. His knuckles went white as he gripped the driving wheel. Mason's temperature dropped abruptly as his truck drove through the area where the figure was standing, and he heard what sounded like a whisper near his ear. "I appreciate you not stopping." Behind him, all he could see in his rearview mirror was an empty roadway. The CB radio went dead as soon as he crossed mile marker 52. Static was all that remained of the voices that had been warning him and chatting for the last hour. Mason attempted to reach out on several channels to see if anyone could hear him, but he got no answer. Throughout the remainder of his journey, the radio functioned well, picking up typical trucker conversation as he got closer to inhabited areas, but he never heard from Desert Ghost, Iron Eagle, Midnight Rider, or any of Once More, the other ghostly voices. The following morning, when Mason arrived in Salt Lake City, he made the decision to learn more about Route 191's mile marker 52. His greatest concerns were validated by what he saw in historical newspaper archives. At that precise spot, almost 24 truckers had lost their lives in single-vehicle accidents in the previous 40 years. They all involved abrupt swerving movements that investigators were never able to explain. Every accident had a similar pattern. For no apparent reason, seasoned drivers with spotless safety records abruptly lose control of their cars. Mason also found something else that made him shiver. Investigators discovered that the deceased driver's CB radios were set to obscure channels and frequencies that truckers didn't frequently use in a number of the accident reports. In one instance from 1987, even after the truck's electrical equipment was broken in the collision, the examining officer observed that the driver's radio continued to broadcast a weak signal. Mason never again traveled that section of Arizona on Route 191. Instead of risking another run-in with the ghostly truckers that patrol that desolate roadway, he asked for route alterations that extended his travels by hundreds of miles. However, Mason occasionally switches his CB to those unusual channels while driving other desert roadways late at night in order to listen for sounds that might be attempting to alert other vehicles about the threats that lie ahead. Iron Eagle and the rest have never been heard by him again, but he is aware that they are out there, trying to prevent the living from joining their never-ending convoy on the highways of the dead by broadcasting their warnings into the night of the desert. Let's go on to the fourth tale. Faith, a social media influencer and travel blogger, was recording her cross-country road journey in March 2020 for her well-known Instagram account, Wanderlust Faith, when she chose to take the picturesque route through Highway 50 in Nevada is renowned for being the most desolate road in the United States. What began as content production for her 50,000 followers evolved into an event that she never published online but chronicled in her travel journal. An encounter with a location that should not exist based on all maps and GPS systems. As the Eden sun started to drop, Faith had been driving non-stop from Reno for 6 hours, navigating the enormous Nevada desert, the mountains in the distance. She intended to arrive in Ela by dusk. However, she became aware that she had significantly miscalculated the distances involved as night fell over Highway 50. Her rental Toyota Camry's gasoline indicator was getting close to the quarter tank level. The next petrol station was still more than 80 miles away, according on her GPS. She hadn't seen another car for more than an hour, and the temperature was steadily decreasing. She noticed the neon sign shining in the distance at that point, a dazzling blue and pink beacon piercing the darkness on the desert like a real-life mirage. The words Desert Rose Motel appeared in cursive script as she approached, with an arrow pointing toward a group of modest buildings set back from the highway. A smaller neon sign beneath the larger one flashed vacant in bright red letters. Faith had a rush of relief. Although it wasn't common for isolated parts of Nevada, she hadn't seen any mention of this motel on any review sites or travel websites. Her headlights swept across a scene that appeared to have been frozen in amber since the 1950s as she drew into the gravel parking lot. The motel was made up of 12 separate units that were grouped around a central courtyard in a L configuration. Pastel hues that had faded but nonetheless still had their beauty were painted on each door. Several parking spots were occupied by vintage Eisenhower-era vehicles. Shining under the old-fashioned street lighting in the parking lot were a 1957 Chevrolet Bear, a Ford Thunderbird in immaculate shape, and what looked to be a completely restored Cadillac Eldorado. Warm golden light poured through the huge windows of the office, which was located in a separate structure at the front of the complex. Through the glass, Faith could see a reception desk that looked like it belonged in a Norman Rockwell painting, and wood-paneled walls covered with tourism pamphlets. A nice bell rang as she forced her way through the front entrance, and the decor's meticulous attention to detail caught her interest right once. From the antique Coca-Cola machine in the corner to the furnishings from the atomic age, everything appeared to be historically accurate. A woman who looked to be in her 40s stood behind the desk, her apron looking as if it had been starched to within an inch of its life, and her flowered dress immaculately pressed. Her makeup was applied with the accuracy of a professional picture photographer, and her hair was arranged in an intricate bouffant that must have taken hours to create. She grinned warmly as she looked up from a guest registry book, a real, physical ledger, not a computer system. The woman responded, "Welcome to the Desert Rose Motel, honey," with a faint accent that Faith couldn't quite identify. "I am Mrs. Patterson, and I will be looking after you this evening. You appear to be in need of a good night's sleep after traversing all that desolation." Mrs. Patterson's speech had an air of antiquity, with words and intonations that brought to mind Faith's grandmother's tales of small-town America from decades before. Faith inquired about pricing and clarified that she needed a room for the night. Even for a far-flung desert motel, Mrs. Patterson's estimated price of $12 for a single room sounded absurdly low. Faith said she just had credit cards, and they would be happy to trust her for payment in the morning, but they preferred cash. Patterson added with a smile. In contrast to the impersonal efficiency of contemporary commercial hotels, the entire exchange felt surprisingly authentic. Mrs. Patterson manually completed the registration form. Faith saw that there were dozens of entries in the guest registry, all of which were written in different types of cursive handwriting that appeared to span several decades. She glimpsed names and dates, some more recent, some seemingly from the 1960s and 1970s. She found it strange that each and every entry seemed to have been written with fountain pens or other antiquated writing implements, and that many of the signatures had a complex formality that was no longer common. Mrs. Patterson gave Faith a real metal key fastened to a big plastic cactus-shaped tag. "My sweetheart, you're in room 7. With a view of the desert sunrise, it's our most luxurious property. I believe you'll find everything you need for a comfortable stay, even though the amenities may appear a little outdated in comparison to what you're used to." She pointed to a rack of travel pamphlets advertising places Faith was quite sure had vanished. Roadside dinosaur parks, drive-in theaters, and motor lodges like Chief Running Bear's Wigwam Village. When Faith first saw the office, room 7 was just what she had anticipated. A mid-20th century time capsule in pristine condition. The kidney-shaped mirror and the mica table with its boomerang design were examples of genuine mid-century modern furniture. Over the dresser, the blanket has an orange and turquoise atomic age motif. Additionally, the bathroom had unique black and pink tile work that would have been extremely expensive to duplicate. The television itself was a real 1950s model, complete with rabbit ear antennas and a circular screen. Throughout the evening, Faith meticulously recorded everything in her trip journal, highlighting the motel's remarkable historical accuracy. In order to post pictures to her Instagram account, she attempted to establish a Wi-Fi signal, but the phone displayed absolutely no service, even the emergency signal that she typically finds in isolated places. In fact, the full digital blackout was pleasant since it allowed her to explore the location without being distracted by messages or feeling compelled to post everything right away online. The other visitors she met were what really made the event surreal. She came upon a young couple who appeared to have walked out of a 1950s magazine ad while strolling about the courtyard. The woman had victory rolls in her hair and was wearing a circle skirt and saddle shoes, while the man was dressed in a cardigan sweater and immaculately ironed slacks. As they sat on folding chairs outside their room, they listened to what sounded like real 1950s radio programming on a vintage portable radio while sharing a bottle of Coca-Cola. "Isn't this evening lovely?" Faith walked past and the woman shouted out, "The Hendersons are on their way to Salt Lake City from Los Angeles. Dear, are you also on vacation?" She spoke with the same old-fashioned formality. Additionally, the pair appeared to be quite perplexed by references to smartphones, social media, or current affairs when Faith attempted to bring up contemporary subjects. Faith met a number of other visitors later that night, all of whom appeared to have the same anachronistic trait. One old man, claiming to be a traveling salesman, was wearing a suit that appeared to have been tailored during the Truman era and was carrying a real leather sample bag. 3 kids were playing with toys that seemed more like genuine vintage goods than contemporary ones. Replicas, and their vehicle was a 1959 Buick that had been well maintained and had no indications of restoration. Around midnight, Faith heard music floating across the courtyard, which was the most disturbing moment. She followed the sound and found it was coming from the motel's small activity room, where a number of guests were dancing to music played on an old Wurlitzer jukebox, the type of big band orchestral compositions that had been popular during World War II. Everyone appeared to be having a great time and was dressed appropriately for the historical period. Faith, however, felt as though she was viewing a movie through thick glass when she attempted to join the group. As though she were in a slightly different universe, the other guests politely acknowledged her presence, but were unable to really connect with her. During the sleepless night in room 7, Faith alternated between being fascinated by the motel's amazing realism and becoming increasingly uneasy about the actions of the other guests. The location was flawless in every way. Too flawless, as though millions of dollars had been spent to produce the most realistic historical replica imaginable. However, the visitors themselves treated 1950s society and technology as though they were entirely modern, seemingly oblivious to the fact that they were living in the past. When Faith awoke the following morning, she discovered freshly made coffee and pastries outside her door. as well as a handwritten message from Mrs. Patterson expressing gratitude for her stay at the Desert Rose Motel. The coffee arrived in a real ceramic thermos that would have looked right at home in a museum, and the breakfast items were wrapped in old wax paper and strung with string. The office was locked with a note that said, "Gone fishing back this afternoon." Faith chose to put payment under the door when she attempted to locate Mrs. Patterson to pay for her room and return the key. Office door and started packing her car so she could continue her trip. She gave the Desert Rose Motel one last glance in her rearview mirror as she pulled out of the parking spot, intending to take some last pictures when she got to a place where cell service was available. However, after only a few hundred yards of driving, the motel was gone when she looked back. The other visitors, the buildings, the neon sign, and the old cars. Everything has vanished as though it had never been there. Faith turned around and drove back to the location of the motel, feeling confused and a little scared. She discovered that the horizon was nothing but barren desert, with no indication that any buildings had ever been there. The sagebrush and untouched sand had taken the place of the gravel parking lot. No foundation marks, wheel footprints, or indications that the Desert Rose never before had motel been anything but a dream. Faith started looking online for any mention of the Desert Rose Motel on Highway 50 as soon as she got to Eli and had cell service. However, she couldn't find anything. No reviews, no websites, no old records, no pictures. Every digital map and satellite image she could find showed that the area where she had spent the night was devoid of any form of construction. The motel was not mentioned on Nevada travel websites. Additionally, there were no records of any mid-century hospitality establishments in that area of the desert when she contacted the state's Historical Preservation Office. The porcelain coffee thermos on her passenger seat, the brass key remaining in her pocket, and the thorough notes she had made in her travel notebook were the only reminders Faith had of her adventure. However, she discovered something unsettling when she looked more attentively at these objects in the daytime. The thermos had a patina of age that indicated it was truly vintage and not a replica, and the key was corroded and worn as though it had been used for decades. Because no one believed her story, Faith finally stopped sharing the incident with friends and family and never mentioned the Desert Rose Motel on social media. However, she retained the thermos and the metal key. Additionally, she occasionally finds herself searching for neon signs that promise hospitality and rest from a bygone era when she is driving through isolated locations late at night. The Desert Rose Motel has never been located by her. However, she has never lost hope that Mrs. Patterson is still standing behind her reception desk on Highway 50, ready to greet tired tourists in a world where the past isn't going to be buried. Let's go on to the fifth tale. October 15, 2017. Officer Blake of the California Highway Patrol was assigned to the Death Valley Patrol Sector for 3 months when he came upon an issue that would contradict all he believed to be true about his work. Because of his reputation for meticulous reporting and his capacity to manage the particular difficulties of policing one of the most isolated and hazardous sections of highway in the American West, Officer Blake had been specifically asked for the Death Valley duty. The events of that night on Route 160 would go down in Inyo County Sheriff's Department history as the most in-depth and disturbing police report. Officer Blake was patrolling the area of Route 160 that leads to Death Valley from the Nevada border as part of his routine evening patrol. This is a lonely stretch of highway that receives very little traffic during the day and is almost deserted after dark. Local law enforcement was aware of the region's high rate of single-vehicle collisions, equipment malfunctions, and stranded drivers who failed to account for the severe Mojave Desert conditions. Blake had answered numerous calls in this region. During his 3 months on the job, he dealt with everything from hot cars to the heartbreaking stories of people who had wandered into the desert and never came back. Precisely at 3:33 a.m., Blake saw a stream of headlights coming from the east while he was stationed at his typical observation spot close to mile marker 78, keeping an eye on radio activity and filling out paperwork from a previous traffic stop. This was nothing out of the ordinary. In order to avoid the intense heat of the day, convoys of commercial trucks or military vehicles would occasionally pass through the region in the early morning. However, Blake became aware that something was seriously up with what he was witnessing as the cars approached. With precisely calibrated distances between each vehicle, The convoy of about 12 automobiles traveled in perfect formation. There was something peculiar about their headlights. Modern cars create beams of light that are either bright white or yellow, but antique lights had a mellow amber glow that made Blake think of the sealed beam headlights found in 1940s and 1950s vehicles. The cars were traveling at precisely 45 miles or more, which was strangely slow considering the highway's 70-mile speed limit. Blake had a clear view of the cars as the convoy passed his position, and he felt his knowledge and training clash with something his logical mind was unable to comprehend. A 1947 Packard sedan in immaculate shape was the main vehicle, and then came a string of vehicles that appeared to have been taken straight out of showrooms decades prior. A 1954 Cadillac Eldorado, a 1949 Mercury Coupe, a 1952 Buick Roadmaster, and a number of other automobiles that Blake had seen in his grandfather's vintage auto magazines, with paint jobs that showed no traces of age or wear and chrome that shone. In the moonlight, every car was in flawless shape. The fact that Blake could see the people inside every car added to the site's eerie atmosphere. There seemed to be a family unit in each car. Children in the back, parents in the front, all dressed in attire appropriate for the time period of their cars. The grown-ups were dressed in dresses and suits that appeared to have been ironed that morning. Additionally, the youngsters were dressed in the type of formal clothing that families wore in the years following World War II for big events. There was no sign of any of the passengers realizing their surroundings or looking around. With faces of serene resolve, they all gazed straight ahead, seemingly intent on arriving at a place that only they could see. Blake quickly turned on the emergency lights on his police car and started to follow the caravan with the intention of performing a standard traffic stop to check licenses and registration. However, as he sped up to overtake the back car, an impossibility occurred. He kept his speedometer reading at 75 miles, but he was unable to get closer to the convoy in his patrol car. The vintage cars kept on going, at their constant speed of 45 mph. But no matter how rapidly he drove, they always managed to stay precisely the same distance ahead of him. Blake turned on his radio to alert dispatch to the situation after a few minutes of this futile chase. Control, Unit 47 is requesting backup for a traffic stop around mile marker 82 on eastbound, Route 160. I'm driving at 45 mph in a 70 mph zone while following a convoy of about 12 vintage cars from the 1940s and 1950s. Unknown causes prevent me from getting close. Ask for help and perhaps a 1054 for a mechanical examination. The radio crackled at the dispatcher's response, her voice betraying her uncertainty. Please replay your most recent broadcast, Unit 47. You mentioned vintage cars, right? The dispatcher asked Blake for the vehicle license plate numbers once he verified his claim. Blake's gut dropped as he read the license plate out loud while focusing his beam on the convoy's back car, a 1953 Chevrolet Bear. The California license plate DJ4792 is shown on the control rear car. The black and yellow design of the plate seems to be old rather than modern. The dispatcher waited a long moment before answering. When she did, her tone had become quite professional, the kind of tone Blake knew dispatchers used when they were speaking with supervisors. Please remain in your place and carry on observing Unit 47. We are currently running that plate number. It felt like the wait would never stop. Additionally, Blake saw that the convoy had started to slow down even more. At this point, the cars were moving at around 30 miles per hour. Blake also saw that they were getting close to the Badwater Road turnoff, which took them farther into Death Valley and towards some of the park's most isolated and hazardous areas. The dispatcher's voice came back at last, and Blake could sense the worry and bewilderment in her voice. Unit 47 was assigned to a 1953 Chevrolet Bear with license plate DJ4792, registered to Bakersfield, California residents Robert and Helen Morrison. However, according to our records, on October 15, 1957, precisely 60 years ago to the day, this vehicle and its occupants were engaged in a deadly accident on Route 160. While on a family vacation in Death Valley, the car slid off the road, close to mile marker 85. They killed all 4 occupants. Blake noticed a noticeable dip in temperature inside his patrol cruiser as he processed this data. He asked dispatch to run more license plates from the convoy right away. And a terrible pattern developed over the course of the following several minutes. On or near Route 160, all of the convoy's vehicles had been involved in deadly accidents. They all took place on October 15th in various years between 1947 and 1965. All of the residents had been families on vacation or sightseeing excursions in Death Valley. Additionally, in each instance, the cars had veered off the road in the same general vicinity of mile marker 85. Blake saw that the surrounding terrain was starting to shift in ways that were inexplicable as he kept up with the ghostly procession. The mile markers appeared to be counting backwards rather than forwards, and the well-known landmarks he relied on for navigation were changing positions. His GPS, his radio conversations with dispatch were getting more and more cluttered with static, and the unit was showing him coordinates that put him in places he knew he couldn't be. Blake followed the truck farther into Death Valley when they finally turned onto Badwater Road. The vintage automobiles continued their stately parade over the moonlit landscape, despite his instincts as a desert survival expert and a police officer telling him this was a terrible error. Their inhabitants are still gazing straight ahead with those serene, resolute expressions. Blake became aware that they were approaching the Badwater Basin, which is North America's lowest point and among the most hostile locations on Earth. The caravan halted in perfect synchronicity as they entered the Badwater parking lot. Watching. From a safe distance, Blake parked his police car and saw the 12 vehicle's passengers emerge onto the salt flats. The families walked hand in hand into the basin's center, where the mineral deposits produced an otherworldly panorama of crystalline forms with timed precision. Deeper into the salt flats, they seemed to be traveling down a path visible only to themselves, until they came to a place where the moonlight seemed to curve about them. After grabbing his powerful flashlight and radio, Blake started walking after the families, announcing to them that they should stop for interrogation. However, the desert air seemed to swallow his speech, leaving no echo and seemingly no reaction from the ghostly travelers. He could hear them conversing in voices that were audible over the group as he approached them. Quiet surroundings. They were chatting about the places they wanted to explore in Death Valley and the pictures they wanted to shoot while on vacation. As parents pointed out geological features to their kids and shared information from tourist pamphlets created decades ago, the conversations were brimming with enthusiasm and anticipation. Their conversation was particularly disturbing since they appeared to be utterly oblivious to their death, continuing to plan events and make choices as though their interrupted holidays were still going on as planned. At precisely 4:44 a.m., the family halted their stroll and faced east in the direction of the sun's rise in a few hours. For a few minutes, they stood in complete quiet, and Blake noticed that several of them were embracing or holding hands, as though they were getting ready for something important. Then, with the same synchronized precision they had shown previously, they started marching back toward their trucks without any visible indication or communication. Blake attempted to stop the Morrisons, one of the families, from getting into the 1953 Chevrolet. However, there was nothing but empty air when he arrived at the location where they ought to have been standing. He was still able to see them clearly and hear them talking about the lovely sunrise they were going to see. However, they were located in an area that was inaccessible to him. They appeared to be passing through the same terrain, but in another realm, one that was essentially distinct from his own world, but occasionally crossed over. The families went back to their cars and formed a convoy again. However, they started traveling straight into the center of Death Valley via roads that Blake had never seen on any map, rather than turning around and returning to Route 160. The ancient vehicles maneuvered. They traversed salt flats that would have wrecked their tires and suspensions, climbed rocky hills, and traversed terrain that should have been unsurmountable for cars of their time. Blake followed them as far as he could drive his patrol car. However, he was forced to halt and observe as the convoy vanished into an increasingly unreal and unattainable scene. The amber glow of their headlights cresting a ridge that his topographical maps claimed didn't exist was the last thing Blake saw. As though the families were getting a final glimpse of the planet they had left behind before vanishing entirely into whatever realm they called home, the lights briefly lingered on the horizon. Blake spent the remainder of his shift recording every aspect of his interaction with photographic accuracy and following police protocol, creating a report that he knew no one would believe. Blake was immediately moved to a different assignment and required to have a psychological test once his boss read the report the following day. However, the assessment revealed no indications of stress, hallucinations, or mental disease, and he was entirely calm and logical. It wasn't until years later that Blake realized he wasn't the first officer to come upon the convoy on October 15th. Similar reports from other police were found in department records dating back to the 1970s. They all described the same vintage cars, the same families, and the same impossibly long parade across Death Valley. Each report, which detailed contacts that had taken place precisely at 3:33 a.m. on October 16th, was filed. On October 15th, and each officer who submitted such a report was discreetly moved to a new position. Every October 15th, Blake drives out to mile marker 78 and parks at his former observation point. But he never again guarded Route 160 during the night. He has met other former patrol policemen who have told him about their own experiences with the spectral families, but he has never seen the convoy again. They established an informal support group with active and former policemen who recognize that not everything can be explained by logical investigation or police protocol. Blake claims he can still hear the distant sound of antique engines and see the amber glow of headlights belonging to families who are still attempting to finish vacations that were interrupted 60 years ago, especially in the middle of the night when the desert wind is roaring across the salt flats. Still looking for the picture-perfect sunrise in a place where time is meaningless, and the deceased keep traveling interminably toward places they will never arrive at. Let's go on to the sixth tale. Carlos Mendoza, a seasoned long-haul truck driver, was traveling U.S. Route 491 from Denver to Phoenix in September 2019 with a load of auto parts. Route 666 was the name of the route prior to its menacing numerical identification. Was modified in 2003. For more than 18 years, Carlos had been a professional driver, traveling millions of miles on American roads. However, he had always tried to stay away from this specific section of road. Even experienced drivers were influenced to alter their routes by the tales that other truckers shared about Route 491. And Carlos knew that some roads were better, left to others because he had heard enough CB chatter over the years. However, he was compelled to go on the cursed highway that evening due to a lucrative contract and a strict delivery date. And he would be plagued by what he experienced for the remainder of his driving career. Around 11:45 p.m., Carlos drove his Freightliner Cascadia into the New Mexico portion of Route 491 while towing a 53-foot trailer full of powertrain parts. With juniper trees strewn about and tall red rock formations forming a strange landscape, beneath the stars, the highway extended ahead of him like a dark ribbon slicing across the high desert terrain. In an attempt to kill time, he had been listening to trucker banter on Channel 19 on his CB radio, but the airwaves were disturbingly quiet. Carlos had driven on a major trucking route for 18 years, and he had hardly ever experienced such total radio quiet. Around mile marker 47, just as Carlos was getting used to the rhythm of the lengthy desert haul, the first indication that something was amiss appeared. He caught a glimpse of movement along the highway. What are the dark shapes parallel to? His truck seemed to be unachievable speeds. As he looked over his shoulder, he noticed what seemed like a group of big dogs following his car, which was moving at 65 miles per hour. However, these were not your typical canines. They were enormous animals, easily the size of German shepherds or more, and their icy black fur appeared to absorb rather than reflect the moonlight. At first, Carlos thought he was witnessing coyotes, or maybe savage dogs that had fled along the highway after being spooked by his truck's approach. The desert was home to many predator species that could appear dangerous in low light, and it was not unusual for wildlife to act suspiciously around huge cars. But as Carlos kept watching the herd, he became aware that these animals were acting in ways that went against every known law of physics and biology. Without any obvious symptoms of strain or exhaustion, the creatures were moving at a steady pace that matched the 65 km/h speed of his truck. They did not exhibit the bounding or erratic movement patterns that are characteristic of running dogs, and their gait was abnormally smooth. Carlos questioned whether he was actually seeing animals at all as they flowed across the arid landscape with an almost liquid grace, resembling shadows given form. Most unsettlingly, when his headlights passed over them when the road turned, the animals created no shadows, and their eyes didn't reflect any light at all. Instead, their faces were blank black spaces. Taking his CB microphone, Carlos dialed in channel 19, his voice trembling a little as he spoke. Breaker 119. Desert Freight is traveling east on 491 close to mile marker 48. Are there any drivers nearby? Copy. I need some eyes on this because I have a wildlife dilemma. He flipped through a few channels, waiting for a response, but the radio was still dead silent, save for the slight static that appeared to beat in time with his own heartbeat. Since he had first seen the monsters, the pack had gotten bigger. At least 12 animals had grown from the initial 6 or 7, and they were no longer happy to just run beside his truck. The animals started occasionally racing straight front of his car before swerving away at the last second, weaving back and forth across the highway. The creatures seemed to predict Carlos's every move with miraculous accuracy, but Carlos had to constantly change his position and pace to avoid what looked to be inevitable collisions. As the chase went on, Carlos saw that the animals were acting in ways that no animal on Earth would. They started jumping over the cab of his truck, their bodies going straight through his headlights beam without creating any shadows on the road. He could see them sprinting alongside his trailer when he glanced in his side mirrors, but the mirror glass did not reflect them. He felt as though he was being pursued by living shadows that were present in the real world but disregarded its laws. One of the things went straight toward the driver's side of his cab and seemed to go right through the door and inside the truck, which was the most scary moment. Carlos's body temperature dropped abruptly, and he heard heavy breathing near his ear. However, when he looked around, nothing was there. He couldn't see it, but he could feel it since the thing had somehow gotten into his cab without opening any windows or doors. For a few minutes, the breathing sound persisted, accompanied by the pronounced smell of decay and sulfur. Carlos attempted to contact for assistance via his cell phone, but even though he was in a location where he had good coverage in most cases, even more unsettling was when he attempted to light up the inside of the cab with the flashlight on, the phone. There were pockets of complete blackness that moved around the truck's interior on their own, as if something invisible was absorbing the light. Behind him, he could hear the thing moving, its claws clicking against the cab's metal floor. However, each time he looked nothing was there. At least 20 of the shadow monsters were now rushing beside Carlos, who calculated that the herd outside his truck had gotten considerably bigger. With animals on either side of his truck and a few more rushing straight in front of it, they had created the ideal escort formation. Carlos could see that the faces of the animals in front of him should have been on their heads, but every now and again they turned back toward him. All that was there were voids that, like tiny black holes, seemed to draw light into themselves. The animals started acting differently as Carlos got closer to mile marker 55, which increased his level of fear. They began to scream. Sounds that sounded as though they were coming from something that had never been alive at all, rather than the typical dog or wolf vocalizations. The scream was a blend of high-speed reverse playback of electronic feedback, mechanical grinding, and what sounded like human cries. The noises were so intense that they caused the cab windows to rattle and overpowered the sound of his truck's engine. The mechanical systems of his truck appeared to be affected by the roaring. Despite keeping constant pressure on the accelerator, his engine started to run rough, and the RPM gauge started to fluctuate crazily. The electrical systems were breaking down as well. His headlights flickered on and off in time with the wailing of the beast. Then bursts of static that sounded almost like voices speaking in an unidentified tongue started to come from his CB radio. Then, suddenly, the thing that had somehow gotten into his cab appeared. In his peripheral vision, Carlos caught a glimpse of it. Sitting in his passenger seat was a huge dog-like figure made entirely of what seemed to be living darkness. Carlos's heartbeat synchronized with the bright crimson eyes of the beast, and he saw rows of fangs that like shards of broken glass when it opened its mouth. An overpowering sense of old hunger and malevolence pervaded the cab as the beast entered. A voice whispered straight into Carlos's thoughts, "You're on the devil's highway now." Even though the creature's mouth remained motionless, "You have been selected to join the pack and are now in our territory. Carlos's mind was filled with images that accompanied the voice. Other drivers' visions of the demon canines they had met over the years. Some of them had been discovered dead in their taxis for no apparent reason. Others had just disappeared with their cars, leaving behind nothing except the lingering smell of sulfur and skid marks. Carlos gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white, and he started praying out loud, reciting all the prayers he could recall from his early years. The monster in his passenger seat started to twist and contort as he prayed, as though the words were hurting it physically. Alongside his truck, the pack began to fall back. Instead of being hunting calls, their howling was taking on elements of annoyance and anger. Carlos's realization occurred when he recalled the rosary that hung from his rearview mirror and was a gift from his grandma. The thing in his passenger seat shrieked as he reached for it, still praying, and then started to disintegrate like smoke, sounding like metal being ripped apart. Outside his truck, the pack dispersed in all directions and vanished into the desert as though they had never been there. Carlos's truck's systems went back to normal right away. His CB radio crackled and his headlights glowed brighter than before. Back to usual trucker conversation. With trembling hands, he reached for his microphone and sent out a broad appeal for any nearby drivers. He was relieved to receive a number of answers from truckers who were curious as to where he had been for the past hour. They reported that his truck had been seen on the highway, but he had not answered several radio calls while the pack was pursuing him. Carlos reported the incident to his dispatch office and thought about alerting the police when he arrived in Phoenix the next morning, but he eventually concluded that no one would believe his description of the events on Route 491. Rather, he started studying the highway's history and found that stories of meetings with demonic black canines had been around since the 1920s, when the road was first built. Legends of shadow creatures that hunted travelers were common among the local Native American tribes, and over the years, a number of truckers had shared similar encounters, but the majority were hesitant to discuss them in public. Carlos discovered that Route 491 was known as the Devil's Highway since it was first designated as Route 666. In 2003, the highway's notoriety for strange accidents and paranormal encounters led to a change in its numerical classification. However, the nature of whatever beings used that section of road as their hunting area remained same despite the change in the number. Unofficial trucker networks and internet forums reported that the Demon Dog Pack was still active and targeted drivers who drove alone on the highway at night. Carlos discovered the most unsettling data from Route 491 accident records and missing person situations. Numerous drivers have been discovered dead in their cars over the last 50 years with no obvious reason for their passing. Although their trucks were unharmed, they were filled with the overpowering smell of sulfur. The other drivers had just disappeared. With the engine still running and no indication of what had happened to the occupants, their cars were discovered abandoned on the side of the road. Even though avoiding Route 491 cost Carlos thousands of dollars in lost efficiency over the years, and added hundreds of miles to some runs, he never drove it again. From then on, he also made care to ride in convoy with other trucks whenever feasible during the night and carried blessed religious things in his truck. However, occasionally late at night while driving through other isolated regions, Carlos hears howling in the distance carried by the desert wind and spots dark shapes moving just out of his headlights, reminding him that some roads are patrolled by creatures that have been hunting travelers and were never alive, even before the first roadway was constructed. Let's proceed to the eighth tale. One of the most unsettling 911 calls ever recorded by the Riverside County Sheriff's Department occurred on the evening of July 3, 2021, on Interstate 10 close to Blythe, California. The event started when several drivers claimed to have seen a nude woman speeding through the desert next to the highway, acting in a way that suggested either a serious mental illness or something far darker. The fact that the entire incident was recorded in real time during a 911 call that lasted more than 18 minutes gave detectives a horrific audio record of what happened, which is what made this case so unsettling. At 2:47 a.m., the first call was received. From Michael Torres, a truck driver transporting fruit from Interstate 10's eastbound lanes connect Phoenix with Los Angeles. After 12 years of professional driving, Michael had seen his fair share of oddities on American roads, but nothing had prepared him for what he saw in the isolated desert area between Blull and Desert Center. When he told the 911 dispatcher about the first sighting, his voice was firm but obviously frightened. "What's your emergency?" 911. Sarah Chen, a dispatcher who had been working the overnight shift at the station, spoke in a professional manner. For more than 5 years at the Riverside County Communication Center, the report she was about to receive would turn out to be the most disturbing instance of her career, even though she was used to answering calls regarding anything from car accidents to wildlife encounters. Michael's voice carried the bewilderment and worry of someone attempting to make sense of an impossibility. "Ma'am, this is going to sound crazy, but I'm eastbound on I-10 near mile marker 47, and there's a naked woman running alongside the highway. For the past 2 miles or so, she has been following my pickup at 65 M&M appears. She is undoubtedly human, and she is undoubtedly keeping up, though I'm not sure how that's possible." Dispatcher Chen started by asking Michael's precise position and whether the woman seemed distressed or in need of medical assistance, as is customary when pedestrians are reported on the roadway. However, as Michael went on to explain, it became evident that this was not like any other normal highway incident that the dispatch center had ever dealt with. "Ma'am, she's not just jogging. I've never seen her move like this before. She is not exhibiting any symptoms of fatigue, and her feet are not making the proper contact with the ground. She hasn't slowed down or altered her pace in the 10 minutes that I've been observing her. And there's a problem with her face, ma'am. I can see that there is a serious problem with her face even in my headlights." Keeping Michael on the line, Chen sent units to the scene, requesting that he keep updating them on the woman's whereabouts and actions. More information came to light as the discussion went on, creating a more unsettling picture of what was taking place on that remote section of highway. According to Michael, the woman seemed to be fully nude and coated with, in the headlights of his truck, her skin was molded and unnatural due to what appeared to be dirt or mud. Michael went on, "She keeps looking at me," his tone growing more tense with each new development. "She looks at my cab every few seconds. And ma'am, I'm telling you there's something seriously wrong. Her mouth hangs wide as if she's attempting to say something, but it's obvious that Jesus is her tongue. I'm not even sure how to explain it. She has this black substance leaking from her mouth, and it appears to have been pulled out or severed." When Michael mentioned that more cars were starting to come across the fleeing woman on the highway, the scene became more heated. About a mile ahead, a family in an SUV had stopped, presumably after the woman had gone up to them and tried to get inside. Chen sent out more units right away and asked for medical help, believing they were dealing with a person who was either suffering from drug-induced delirium or a serious psychotic episode. "The family in front of you has just gotten back into their vehicle and is speeding away." According to Michael, the Aussie woman is now chasing them after attempting to get into their car. "She simply leaped onto the back of their SUV, ma'am. I am currently observing her. They're traveling at least 70 mph, and she's on the back of their car, somehow hanging on." Although Chen had been prepared for many situations by her training, nothing she had encountered compared to what Michael was describing. She spoke with her manager while keeping in touch with Michael and adding more dispatchers on the call in order to manage the expanding emergency response. Medical helicopters were being put on standby, and highway patrol troops were swarming the area from all directions. When they drove off for Desert Center, the family in the SUV was able to throw off their assailant, but the nude woman instantly turned back to Michael's truck. His increasingly panicked reports said that she had somehow positioned. She was sprinting backward, keeping her eyes on him through the windshield, and she was right in front of his car. He reported a terrifying image, a mutilated-mouthed, dirt-covered woman sprinting at highway speed, looking into his cab with a look of hunger. Michael stated, "She's trying to communicate something," his voice now hardly audible above a whisper. "As though she needs something from me. She keeps pointing at her mouth and then at me." Highway Patrol Officer Janet Rodriguez was the first unit to arrive in the area, approaching from the westbound lanes with her emergency lights activated. "And ma'am, I just realized something that's making me sick to my stomach. She's not breathing. I can see her chest, and it's not moving at all." In her radio report to dispatch, Officer Rodriguez confirmed that there was in fact a naked woman running at highway speeds, but her description added layers of impossibility to an already inexplicable situation. Control. She saw the figure, running alongside Michael's truck in the distance. But what she saw contradicted everything she had assumed about the nature of the call. I can't figure out how this is physically possible, but the subject's movement seems strange. There are no obvious signs of exertion, and the woman, who looks to be in her mid-20s, is completely naked and covered in what appears to be dirt or dried mud. She is also keeping up with the reporting party's car at about 65 miles. Officer Rodriguez tried to position her patrol vehicle to intercept the running woman, but she saw behavior that defied her understanding of human physiology and physics. The woman abruptly changed course and started running straight toward Rodriguez's patrol car, covering the distance between the highway lanes in a matter of seconds. When Rodriguez turned on her spotlight to get a better look, the woman stopped. She also doesn't use her gait normally. I have the subject lighted and immobile around 50 yards away from me. The subject seems to be staring straight at my car, and I can verify earlier allegations of face injuries. The subject ran and stood motionless in the light beam. Rodriguez's voice carried the professional calm of a trained officer, but those listening could sense the underlying tension of someone confronting something beyond normal experience. The standoff lasted for almost 3 minutes, with the woman remaining motionless under Rodriguez's spotlight while additional patrol units arrived on scene. The subject's mouth appears to have been severely damaged, and dark material is visible around the oral cavity. Michael continued to comment from his truck, which he had pulled over approximately a quarter of a mile away, and he reported through the 911 connection that the woman's entire focus appeared to be on Officer Rodriguez's patrol car, and that she was crouching down like an animal, as if she were about to attack. "Ma'am, she's getting ready to jump or run or something," Michael said. Before anyone could react to Michael's warning, the woman launched herself toward Rodriguez's patrol car with a speed and trajectory that defied human capability, landing on the hood of her patrol car with an impact that cracked the windshield through the damaged glass. Officer Rodriguez reported that the subject traveled 50 yards in what seemed like less than 2 seconds. Rodriguez got her first clear view of the woman's face and realized right away why other witnesses had been so disturbed by her appearance. Rodriguez's voice remained steady, despite the impossibility of what she said. "Control, subject is on my vehicle. I can confirm severe facial mutilation. The tongue appears to have been removed and the oral cavity contains what looks like dried blood or some other dark substance. The subject is attempting to bite through my windshield. I need immediate backup and medical response." Rodriguez saw that despite her violent behavior, the woman was not making any noises at all, not even the sound of heavy breathing that would be expected from such intense physical exertion. The woman started to claw at the windshield with fingernails that had been worn down to bloody stubs, leaving streaks of mud and what looked like dried blood on the glass. Her movements were frantic but deliberate, as if she was trying to reach something specific inside the patrol car. Other patrol units arrived and tried to encircle the woman, but she showed an almost supernatural awareness of their movements, jumping from vehicle to vehicle with impossible agility whenever officers approached her position, always staying just out of reach as she continued to try to break into the patrol cars. The officers were left in the bizarre position of pursuing a naked, apparently mute woman who could jump 15 feet between moving vehicles without losing her balance. Officer Rodriguez's decision to get out of her patrol car and try to capture the subject with non-lethal force was the culmination of the situation. As she opened her door, the woman instantly stopped her frantic activity and turned to face the officer with what Rodriguez later described as an expression of profound hunger. The two stood facing each other for a few seconds, and Rodriguez observed that the woman's eyes reflected her flashlight beam like an animal's eyes, glowing with. The subject's eyes are showing retro-reflective characteristics that are typical of nocturnal predators under an unnatural silver light. Rodriguez stated, "This is not normal human physiology," and asked for advice on what to do next. Her training had not prepared her for a scenario in which a person whose basic biology seemed to be fundamentally different from that of normal humans could not be amenable to standard arrest techniques. Abruptly, the woman opened her mouth, demonstrating the complete extent of her oral cavity's devastation. In addition to the tongue being removed, Rodriguez could see that the entire mouth seemed to have been scraped clean, leaving behind only raw, black tissue that gleamed in the flashlight beam. The fact that there was no blood in spite of the injury's evident severity, however, appalled Rodriguez the most. The wounds seemed quite old, as if they had been dried or cauterized. The woman turned and fled straight into the desert before Rodriguez could respond, leaving the roadway at the same unfathomable speed she had shown earlier. In a matter of seconds, she had vanished into the shadows outside the officer's illumination, leaving just the wrecked police car and the faint smell of dried dirt and decay. The woman was never located, even though helicopters equipped with infrared imaging equipment were used to track her right away. Michael Torres reported at the end of the 911 call that the freeway had returned to normal and that the woman had completely disappeared. It had been precisely 18 minutes and 43 seconds. However, people concerned would be affected for a lot longer. Michael Torres took a few weeks off from driving to recuperate from the psychological trauma of the incident, while Officer Rodriguez needed medical attention for stress-related problems. Despite thorough searches utilizing both ground teams and aircraft surveillance, no evidence was located in the desert, and the investigation of the incident turned up no missing person reports that fit the description of the naked woman. Forensics. Experts examined the wrecked patrol car. However, all that was left on the windshield was ordinary desert dirt and what seemed like very ancient, unidentifiable, dehydrated organic debris. Officially, the matter is still pending. In the Riverside County Sheriff's Department files, it is open but not in use. Although some of the more unsettling audio portions have been removed through editing, the 911 call is still utilized for training. Michael Torres modified his route to avoid that portion of Interstate 10 after Officer Rodriguez eventually returned to active duty but asked to be transferred to urban patrol areas. During the study, local Native American tribes were consulted, and a number of tribal elders shared stories of desert spirits that used injured people as bait, travelers off of the safe routes. These myths said that these beings were the remains of those who had perished horribly in the desert and were destined to wander indefinitely in an attempt to share their agony with the living. Drivers on that section of Interstate 10 continue to claim sporadic sightings of a mud-covered figure sprinting alongside the highway in the early morning hours, though it is unclear if the nude runner was such an entity or just a disturbed person with unusual physical skills, constantly looking for something that is never found and constantly just out of headlight range. Let's proceed to the seventh tale. About 40 miles northeast of Batty, Nevada, on November 7, 2022, wildlife photographer Rebecca Chen was preparing her gear for a sunrise picture session on a secluded side road off U.S. Highway 95. For more than 8 years, Rebecca had been working for National Geographic, where she documented desert habitats. Additionally, this specific A-ranger from the area had suggested the spot, saying it featured some of the most pure Mojave desert plants in the area. Rebecca would be forced to give up not only her picture session, but also her entire perspective on what it meant to be isolated in the forest as a result of what she learned that morning. Rebecca had reached the scene at about 4:30 in the morning. Navigating a barely discernible dirt track through a smattering of limestone outcroppings and Joshua trees in her customized Ford Expedition. The closest human population was a closed mining facility around 20 meters away, making the place totally remote. It was precisely because of its remoteness that she had picked this location. She needed to be patient and alone to picture desert wildlife because even far-off human activity could interfere with the natural behaviors she was attempting to document. While she was preparing her telephoto apparatus and creating a hidden, Rebecca, who is blind to sight, saw something strange in the darkness before dawn. She could make out what seemed to be the brightness of a single light source around 200 yards away from where she was, traveling methodically and slowly across the desert floor. The light was too intense to be a torch, and too steady and focused to be a car spotlight. It was as intense as a high-wattage work lamp, the type used for excavation or building projects. Rebecca initially believed that she had inadvertently picked a spot close to a valid construction site. Maybe there was archaeological excavation or geological surveying going on during the cooler nighttime hours. Numerous mining surveys and research projects were conducted in Nevada's desert, and in order to avoid the intense midday temperatures, these operations frequently operated around the clock. She made the decision to look into it out of professional interest and to see whether she could move her photo shoot without interfering with other projects. Rebecca could see more details of what was going on in that remote area of the desert as she moved closer to the light source with her camera gear and a powerful LED flashlight. A lone individual was laboring methodically, excavating what appeared to be a precisely rectangular pit in the hard desert soil with what looked like a combination of hand tools and a small mechanized excavator. The exact measurements were based on the height of the dirt mound and were roughly 6 feet long by 3 feet broad, at least 6 feet deep next to it. Rebecca realized she was staring at someone excavating what could only be called a grave because the measurements were so precise. The excavation was being done by a middle-aged man, most likely in his 50s, dressed in work clothing that appeared to have been bought especially for the job. His boots, work shirt, and pants all looked like they were brand new, free of the stains and worn patches that come with being a frequent manual laborer. He removed dirt and stone from the pit systematically, pausing sometimes to use a measuring tape to check the proportions, all the while working at the slow, steady pace of someone who had all the time in the world. The man's total lack of surprise or worry when he saw Rebecca coming was what was most disturbing about the scenario. He raised his head from his labor, met her gaze directly through the darkness of the desert, and gave her a simple nod of acknowledgement before going back to his dig. He made no effort to explain what he was doing or why he was doing it in such a remote place, and there was no protective posture or shocked reaction. At 5 a.m, he pretended to be digging a lovely burial in the middle of nowhere. Was the world's most natural thing. Rebecca's voice could be heard clearly over the quiet desert air as she called out a hello. "Good morning. I apologize for disturbing you. I noticed your light when photographing wildlife here. Is this an archaeological dig of some sort?" The man paused his work and gave her another glance. This time she described the face as patient, almost paternal. After putting down his shovel, he strolled to the pit's edge and used a fresh towel he took out of his back pocket to wipe his hands. "Not archaeological, no," he said in a cool, conversational voice, as though they were talking about the weather instead of his nighttime dig endeavor. "Preparing for someone who will require something in the near future." With evident delight, he pointed to the precisely rectangular hole in his artistry. "You know, it's crucial to be ready. Working on desert terrain is challenging, particularly if you're pressed for time." As the implications of what he had said started to seep in, Rebecca felt a shiver go down her spine. Preparing for someone. Do you work for a cemetery or funeral home? In response to her query, the man grinned, but it wasn't a consoling smile. The smile belonged to someone who had knowledge that she did not. Someone who was taking pleasure in information that, if fully comprehended, would disturb her. He went back to his work with the same careful precision, saying something along those lines. "A final resting place is necessary for everyone, and it's preferable to have one prepared in advance. Saves a great deal of hassle later." While he was still digging, Rebecca heard him singing to himself, a song she couldn't quite place, but it seemed like a hymn or funeral dirge. In an attempt to get him to talk more, Rebecca questioned him about who had hired him for this work, and if he had the right permits to excavate on what she believed to be public property. However, the man appeared to have lost all interest in conversing, concentrating solely on his digging with a ferocity that suggested he was laboring under pressure. When she asked straight inquiries, all she received were random hums and the occasional mm. Rebecca could make out more features of the man's workplace as the sky lightened with the impending morning. He had set up a set of instruments beside the pit as neatly as a surgeon's tool tray. A pickaxe, a hand tamper for compacting soil, shovels of various sizes, and a number of measurement tools were present. It appeared that this was not his first excavating project because everything was tidy and well maintained. Most unsettling of all, she saw a wooden marker stick next to the tool collection that had an inscription carved into it that she was unable to understand from a distance. The man was digging with remarkable efficiency, and Rebecca could see that he was moving forward steadily in spite of the hard desert earth. Even though he had evidently been working for hours before she came, he exhibited no symptoms of exhaustion, and the pit was now visibly deeper than 6 feet. He moved in a precise and rhythmic manner, as though he was operating according to an internal metronome, at the ideal speed. Partly for documentation purposes and in part because she was starting to get really worried about what she was seeing, Rebecca made the decision to take pictures of the scenario. The man abruptly stopped digging and turned to face her as she lifted her camera and started focusing the telephoto lens. She could see, even from a distance of 200 yards, that his expression had shifted from one of patient focus to one of near predation. Despite the distance, he shouted, "I wouldn't do that if I were you," his voice clear over the desert. He put down his shovel and started to approach her at the same leisurely speed that defined his digging. Some things aren't meant to be recorded. Some preparations need to be kept private. All of Rebecca's instincts told her to get out of there right away. The man kept his steady approach with what appeared to be grim determination, but she started to back toward her car while keeping him in sight. He said, "You know," in a conversational tone, "I wanted to know for whom this hole was intended. Though I wasn't sure who would need it. I'd been sensing for weeks that I needed to excavate it. But everything makes perfect sense now that you're here." Rebecca dropped all pretense of with professional interest. She hurried to her Ford Expedition, threw her photography gear in the back seat, and started the engine with trembling hands that made it difficult for her to turn the key. She saw the man in her rear-view mirror, still approaching her car with the same slow, patient pace, as though he knew she wouldn't be able to get away, as she backed up the dirt track as quickly as she could safely. Rebecca desperately wanted to get away from the enigmatic excavator, but the dirt lane back to Highway 95 was twisty and tight, so she had to go slowly. On multiple occasions, she had to come to a complete stop in order to avoid big rocks or deep ruts. And she expected to see the man walking after her every time she checked her mirrors. However, the desert behind her was still deserted, with only her own dust cloud indicating her movement across the terrain. Rebecca called the NY County Sheriff's Department to report what she had seen as soon as she was able to drive normally and reach Highway 95. Her allegation was taken seriously by the dispatcher, especially when she raised the potential that someone was burying people on public property without permission. Rebecca consented to meet the two deputies at the turnoff and lead them to the scene after they were sent out to conduct an investigation. 3 hours later, the search team went back to the location and discovered nothing at all. There were no indications of recent excavation in the spot where Rebecca had witnessed the man digging. Other than the footprints left by Rebecca's own boots, there were no tire tracks, no pit, no equipment, and no heaps of disturbed ground. Using metal detectors and ground-penetrating radar equipment, the deputies searched the area thoroughly, but were unable to find any indication that anyone had been digging there. The most disturbing of all was that when the deputies marked the specific position where Rebecca claimed to have seen the dig using GPS coordinates, they found that the same region had been the scene of 3 inexplicable disappearances in the previous 15 years, according to county records. Off-road enthusiasts, photographers, and hikers had disappeared into thin air. Rebecca went back to the location once more after seeing their cars abandoned, but there was no sign of what had happened to the occupants. In daylight, with several witnesses there and accompanied by 2 sheriff's deputies and a county surveyor, the scene seemed entirely normal, simply another area of the Mojave Desert devoid of any indications of human habitation. However, just as they were about to go, the surveyor made a revelation that altered everything. He found a rectangular void beneath the surface using ground-penetrating radar, around 6 feet long, 3 feet broad, and 6 feet deep, situated precisely where Rebecca had observed the man excavating. The surveyor insisted that the void's proportions were too exact and its shape too regular to be anything other than human excavation when asked if it could be a naturally occurring geological structure. However, the sheriff's department discovered only undisturbed desert soil after obtaining permission to excavate the location. There was no tangible proof to back up Rebecca's story, because the radar anomaly had vanished as magically as it had appeared. Rebecca never went back to work as a photographer in that part of Nevada, citing personal reasons for her job choice. She eventually quit desert wildlife photography completely and asked to be reassigned to different ecosystems. However, she meticulously documented her experience, including GPS data and pictures of the approximate area, which she frantically reviewed for months after the event. 6 months later, Rebecca discovered the death of another wildlife photographer, which was the most upsetting part of her experience. Been employed in the same broad Nevada region. With his equipment untouched and no indications of foul play, The photographer had been discovered dead in his tent with no obvious cause. His GPS unit indicated that he had been camping within half a mile of the coordinates where Rebecca had come across the enigmatic digger, according to the investigative report. Stories of similar experiences spanning decades were revealed by long-standing Nevada residents and local desert guides who were discreetly informed about the incident. These unverified reports said that the pit digger was a common occurrence in some Mojave regions, always showing up when someone was about to perish there, and always digging graves with unearthly accuracy for victims who had not yet fallen prey. According to the narrative, a meeting with the digger was both a warning and a death sentence, and the only way to survive it was to leave the region right once and never come back. After a while, Rebecca relocated to the Pacific Northwest, where she currently focuses on taking pictures of forest ecosystems. However, she will never forget the man's systematic and patient excavation of that flawless tomb, or the serene assurance in his voice when he implied that she was the intended recipient of the pit. She occasionally hears the distant sound of digging late at night while she is by herself in the forest, and she questions whether the man is still out there in the Nevada desert, constructing graves for people who haven't realized they would need them yet. Working with the assurance of someone who knows exactly what's going to happen, and the patience of someone who has endless time. Let's go on to the 9th tale. August 2020. Sales of pharmaceuticals. Along what residents refer to as the loneliest road in America, Representative David Chen was traveling in his corporate car along U.S. Highway 50 in Nevada, making the exhausting trip from Reno to Salt Lake City to visit with medical facilities. Over the course of his 5-year career, David had made this drive numerous times and took great satisfaction in his careful preparation. Along the 400-meter course, he was familiar with every rest area, gas station, and mile sign. However, what transpired during his nighttime trip would make him re-evaluate everything he had assumed about the route he used so frequently, and make him wonder if the well-known sites he relied on were as genuine as he had always thought. At 11 p.m., David had departed Reno, intending to travel through the night in order to arrive in Salt Lake City before sunrise. The mechanical condition of his Honda Accord was flawless. His GPS indicated clear weather the entire way, and he had a full tank of gas. The first few hours of the drive went smoothly, with David keeping up his typical speed and using podcasts to kill time as they traveled across the vast expanses of Nevada desert. He was a seasoned traveler who had come to recognize the bleak splendor of the high desert, even in the desolate nighttime hours when he may go for up to 50 miles without seeing another car. The trouble started about 2:30 in the morning. Monsieur David's gasoline gauge started getting close to the quarter tank mark earlier than he had anticipated, about 180 miles east of Reno. His consumption rate was higher than usual, but based on his calculations and prior experience, he should have been able to make it to the town of Ely before needing to refuel. He didn't care all that much. There were a number of 24-hour truck stops and gas stations along Highway 50 that were set up especially to accommodate long-distance drivers who required fuel at night. At that moment, David noticed the Sinclair station emerging from the gloom, up ahead. Bright fluorescent lights highlighted its recognizable green dinosaur emblem, which shone like a beacon through the night of the desert. The station bore a striking resemblance to the vintage Sinclair stations that had been operating on American roads since the 1960s, finished with retro-inspired pumps and a tiny convenience store that had a lovely yellow warmth to it. As he drew into the station, David had a mixture of nostalgia and relief. Finding one of the vintage school service stations brought back memories of his early years spent traveling by car with his parents, which was reassuring. David observed a number of elements that struck him as charmingly antiquated when he pulled up to the pumps. The old-fashioned gas pumps had mechanical counts and analog dials, the kind that needed in. They were easy to use and produced gratifying clicking noises while delivering fuel. Remarkably low prices were shown on the pump faces. Even for rural Nevada in 2020, the listed price of $147 per gallon for regular unleaded looked unaffordable. Since upgrading is costly and customers are few in distant places, David assumed the station had simply not updated its pump displays in years. Almost immediately as David pulled to a stop, a uniformed attendant came out of the station office. Wearing immaculately ironed Sinclair coveralls with his name, Frank, sewn on a patch over the left breast pocket. The man looked to be in his 40s. He looked perfect. His uniform appeared to have just been starched and laundered. He had his hair styled with what looked like real pomade, and he had a polite, professional manner that made David think of service station attendants in old films. Frank walked up to David's car and said, "Good evening, sir," with a sincere smile. He spoke with an old-fashioned professionalism that looked both genuine and a little dated. "Fill her up with regular. Check your oil and water while I'm at it." If the training materials he used to master customer service skills were decades old. In contrast to the impersonal self-service stations that predominated on contemporary highways, David thought the engagement was pleasant. David walked inside the convenience shop to use the restroom and buy refreshments for the rest of his trip, while Frank topped up David's tank. The store's interior served as an ideal time capsule of American business in the middle of the 20th century. The brands and goods on the shelf were ones David had seen as a child, but hadn't seen in years. Coca-Cola glass bottles, retro-style candy bars, and snack foods and wrapper designs that had been phased out decades prior. The cashier had to manually enter prices and compute taxes using a real mechanical cash register. A woman in her 30s stood behind the bar, dressed in an apron and floral frock that seemed to have been lifted from a 1950s advertising campaign. Her makeup was applied with the accuracy of someone who had spent a lot of time in front of a mirror, and her hair was fashioned in flawless victory rolls. Using expressions like, "How may I help you, dear?" and "Will that be all for you tonight?" Hun, that implied she had been schooled in customer service methods from an earlier period. She greeted David with the same antiquated civility that Frank had shown. "It will cost $4. When she rang up David's items on the automated register, she stated, "$73 for the gas and $2.15 for your snacks." When David handed her his credit card, the woman gave it a puzzled look, as though she had never seen such a payment option before. The total seemed impossibly low, even accounting for the rural location and the vintage pricing displayed on the pumps. "Oh, sweetheart, she apologized, "don't have one of those electronic machines." David was taken aback but unconcerned. "Cash only, I'm afraid. There's an ATM right outside if you need to get some money." In order to avoid paying processing fees for credit cards, many distant gas stations were cash only. When he stepped outside to use the ATM, he discovered that it was an outdated device that produced receipts on paper that felt solid and thicker than contemporary thermal printers and mechanically dispensed $20 bills. Paper. Frank completed, filling up his car and cleaning his windshield with the kind of thoroughness that has been uncommon at gas stations for decades, while David was withdrawing cash from the ATM. Instead of using the cheap squeegee and unclean water that most stations provided, he utilized paper towels and real glass cleaner. Additionally, he genuinely enjoyed making sure David's windshield was immaculate. Frank gave David a handwritten receipt with a thorough summary of the services rendered when he came back with cash to pay for his goods. "You drive carefully now, Mr. Chen," Frank assured David while passing his change and receipt to him. "Between here and Salt Lake, the road becomes somewhat desolate, and you never know what you might come across in the dark." As though he knew something about David's travels that he shouldn't have, his warning felt strangely personal and precise. Beyond what was required for the transaction, David had not disclosed his destination or any personal information. David made the decision to question Frank about the path ahead and the locations of other 24-hour services between Salt Lake City and his current position as he got ready to exit the station. In addition to offering thorough instructions and suggestions, Frank mentioned establishments and places that David had visited before. However, David's experience didn't really align with some of the material. In addition to describing road conditions that appeared to be based on out-of-date information, Frank mentioned a truck stop that David was very sure had been shuttered for years. After thanking Frank for his assistance, David turned back onto Highway 50, feeling rejuvenated and prepared to finish the rest of his trip. His father had often talked about the excellent customer service he had experienced at the Sinclair station, which was evocative of the heyday of American highway travel. In his rearview mirror, David took a final look at the station that had delivered such great service as he drove back onto the interstate. The station had vanished. There was nothing but desert horizon where he had just seen the warmly illuminated convenience shop and the bright Sinclair sign. David applied the brakes and came to a stop, looking incredulously into his rearview mirror. He had been staring at the station only moments before, but now there was no sign that anything had ever been there. No glimmer of lights, no trace of a building. David turned around and returned to the location of the station, but all he saw was a pristine desert. There were no concrete pads where pumps might have been, no tire tracks going to or from a service station, and no utility connections or subterranean tanks that would have signaled the existence of a gas station. The most unsettling thing was that, even though he had just been through that precise spot minutes earlier, there were no tire tracks from his own car. David examined his fuel gauge, confused and more terrified than before, and discovered that his tank was still at the quarter-empty level it had been when he first saw the Sinclair station. The gauge indicated that he had never really bought any gas. However, when examining his wallet, he discovered that the precise sum of money he had spent on snacks and gas at a station that didn't seem to exist was gone. He still had the ATM receipt in his pocket. Despite being time-stamped only 20 minutes prior, it displayed a transaction from an unlocatable machine. In the town of Ellery, David drove to the next verified petrol station, which his GPS indicated was 43 miles away. He had plenty of time to reflect on what had transpired and look for logical reasons for his experience during that drive. He thought about how he might have slept off on the way and dreamt the whole thing. However, the ATM documentation and the missing cash indicated that a true incident had taken place. There were no other gas stations within 100 miles of the location of the meeting, which made him wonder whether he had somehow lost his way and stopped at a different station than he had initially believed. David inquired about other gas stations along Highway 50 from the night clerk when he arrived at the alley. There were no Sinclair stations between Fallon and Ellery, which is more than 150 miles away, according to the cashier, a young man who seemed to know the area. Official company directories and local knowledge indicate that there hadn't been a Sinclair station in that area of highway for more than 20 years. When he arrived in Salt Lake City, David made the decision to learn more about the history of petrol stations along Highway 50. What he found in antique highway directions and historical documents was both eerie and fascinating. Yes, there had been a Sinclair station somewhere around where he'd met Frank and the old-fashioned convenience shop. The station was in operation between 1962 until 1987, servicing passengers on what was once a main transcontinental route before most long-distance traffic was rerouted to a more northern path due to the construction of Interstate 80. David discovered the most unsettling data in accident reports and newspaper archives. Throughout its years of operation, the Sinclair station had been the scene of multiple unexplained disappearances. Some days later, travelers would be discovered stranded with empty gas tanks and no recollection of where they had bought gasoline, after stopping for supplies and fuel, paying for their items, and then continuing on the route. In several instances, drivers were discovered dead in their cars, presumably from running out of gas, even though they claimed to have just filled up. After a last instance in which a whole family vanished after stopping for gas, the station was dismantled in 1987. A week later, their car was discovered abandoned on a side road, with all of their personal things still in place and the gasoline tanks empty. The crime was never solved and the family members were never located. The family's credit card had no history of gasoline transactions, according to local officials. Despite many on the night of their disappearance, witnesses said they saw them at the Sinclair station. Additionally, David learned that he was not the only recent visitor to report coming across an unnatural Sinclair station. There were sporadic reports from drivers who had experiences similar to his own on travel websites and online forums, halting at a historic petrol station that offered first-rate service before disappearing into thin air. The majority of these accounts were written off as hallucinations, either as complex hoaxes or as a result of traffic tiredness. However, features that were consistent across several reports pointed to something more significant than mere fantasies. Finding out about the attendant named Frank was the most unnerving part of David's study. A full-time attendant named Frank Morrison had worked the nightly shift from 1962 until his death in 1975, according to employment records from the original Sinclair station. Morrison had probably suffered a heart attack while serving clients throughout the night, as he was discovered dead in the station office one morning. He was committed to giving passengers the finest service possible, according to his co-workers, and the company received messages from a number of clients praising his professionalism and civility. David adjusted his sales region to avoid routes that needed overnight travel through remote locations, and he never again drove Highway 50 alone. However, he saved the ATM receipt from his experience at the Phantom Sinclair station, and occasionally, in the middle of the night, he would study it and ponder the nature of memory and time on the most desolate roads in America. There was never a good reason for what had occurred to him that night. Nevertheless, he came to believe that some locations persist outside of regular time and space, preserved by the commitment of individuals who continue to assist tourists even after they have passed away and are no longer bound by their earthly responsibilities. On remote sections of Highway 50, other drivers still describe coming across old-fashioned petrol stations that always offer great service and affordable rates before disappearing like mirages into the night of the desert. These stations serve as reminders that the most lonely roads in America are never really deserted, whether they are ethereal rest stops for travelers who need assistance more than they think or are temporal relics of a bygone period. And that, attendants who have been honing their customer service techniques for decades past their normal lifespans can occasionally provide the best service. Now let's go on to the 10th story. 3 of the Atacama Desert Mining Consortium's large transport vehicles went missing on March 14, 2023, while on what should have been a normal delivery run along the Ruta Cinco in Chile. One of the world's most barren regions is traversed by the Pan Amian Highway. 3 enormous Caterpillar 797F mining trucks made up the convoy, which was transporting 40 tons of copper concentrate apiece from the isolated Esperanza mine to the Antofagasta processing plant. This occurrence was especially unsettling since it involved more than simply the disappearance of 3 massive vehicles and their crews. But the fact that despite the trucks physically disappearing from satellite monitoring systems, the entire action was recorded via shortwave radio transmissions that lasted for 17 minutes. Carlos Herrera, a seasoned mining truck driver with more than 22 years of experience operating heavy machinery in the Atacama Desert, led the convoy. Miguel Santos, Carlos's normal co-driver, was accompanying him, and the 2 of them had driven this identical trip over 300 times without any problems. Ramon and Eduardo Vega, brothers, drove the second truck, seasoned drivers with more than 10 years of experience with the mining consortia. New members of the operation crewed the third vehicle. Jessica Walsh, an American mining engineer, and Pablo Reyes, a local driver, who served as her translator, were performing efficiency evaluations for the company's investors in North America. At 4:30 a.m., the convoy had left the Esperanza mine. Observing the accepted procedure for transport operations in the desert, before the intense noon heat produced the dust devils and thermal updrafts that may make driving on the highway dangerous, the early morning departure was planned to capitalize on cooler temperatures and more tranquil air conditions. Every vehicle had satellite communication devices, GPS tracking systems, and emergency beacons that sent real-time position updates to the consortium's dispatch center. For the advantage of the American investors who were keeping a close eye on the operation from a distance, Jessica Walsh provided occasional updates in English during radio conversations between the trucks and their base station, which were conducted in a combination of Spanish and English. In accordance with business safety procedures, the convoy kept in regular communication with dispatch, reporting their position, fuel usage, and equipment status every 15 minutes. For the first 3 hours of their trip, everything went according to plan. 7:47 a.m. The first sign that something strange was happening was Carlos Herrera's voice crackling over the radio. Base station. The convoy commander is this person. We can see what looks to be a large dust storm moving in from the southeast. Contact should occur in around 10 minutes. The weather agency asked for advice on whether to continue or take cover because they did not forecast any storm activity in this area. Maria Gonzalez, the dispatch operator, checked with meteorological services right away and discovered that there was no sign of storm activity anywhere along Ruta Cinco. Clear skies and typical atmospheric conditions were visible across the region, according to satellite imagery. However, Maria gave the convoy permission to exercise their own discretion while deciding whether to continue or wait for the disturbance to pass, because the mining consortium's safety procedures were clear about driver autonomy in making decisions regarding hazardous weather circumstances. "This is Truck 2, base station," Eduardo Vega said over the radio. "That cloud of dust is traveling in the opposite direction of the predominant wind. In my 15 years of driving in this desert, I have never witnessed such weather patterns. As it approaches us, the cloud seems to be revolving in place. This does not appear to be any natural dust storm that I have ever seen." In clear but accented English, Jessica Walsh's voice joined the radio discussion. "This is Truck 3, base station. I'm using video equipment to record this climatic phenomenon. The features of the dust production are incompatible with any meteorological processes. As it gets closer to our position, the cloud seems to have perfect symmetry and a geometric structure, in my opinion." The radio communications, which were becoming more frequent as the convoy proceeded along Ruta Cano, were packed with information that described an impending storm that the seasoned desert drivers had never seen before. From the bottom of the desert to an estimated height of 2,000 feet, the dust cloud was said to form a flawless cylindrical wall. Inside the cloud, the drivers reported hearing noises that weren't thunder and seeing flashes of light that weren't lightning, electronic interference and mechanical grinding that appeared to be conveyed through the dust itself instead than the air. "Here is the base station convoy commander. Carlos came in at 8:03 a.m. Our position has been approached by the dust wall. The level of visibility has completely decreased. Our headlights don't reach more than 2 feet in front of the car. Our satellite connectivity is severely interfered with, and GPS signals are sporadic. Our proximity sensors and the roadway reflectors are helping us maintain convoy formation." What followed put all meteorologists' knowledge of atmospheric, physics and desert weather patterns to the test. The radio broadcasts indicated that the dust storm was not acting like any other natural occurrence. The dust looked to be moving in ordered patterns, forming walls and corridors that led the convoy along paths that deviated from the highway they had been traveling, rather than swirling wildly, as dust storms usually do. Eduardo Vega said in a strained, bewildered voice, "This is Truck 2. The GPS is displaying and our compass is spinning freely. Coordinates that put us in places that aren't possible. These readings indicate that even though we are traveling through regions that ought to be mountainous, the road surface is completely level and smooth. Although we can still see the highway signs, they are displaying destinations and distances that are different from what our travel plan calls for." Because of her background in science, Jessica Walsh was able to offer the most in-depth and unsettling accounts of the convoy's experiences. Reporting from base station Truck 3, "It seems that the dust around us is displaying characteristics that defy accepted physics. Perfect geometric shapes are being maintained by the particles, and their responses to our vehicle motions point more toward controlled behavior than typical atmospheric patterns. Even though the outside temperature measurements indicate typical desert conditions, the temperature inside our cab has dropped to almost freezing." Each truck reported progressively improbable sightings throughout the next 8 minutes of radio exchanges. Carlos recounted passing road markers that displayed distances in units that didn't match any established measuring system, and highway signs that promised destinations in languages that none of the drivers could understand. Through the dust, the Vega brothers claimed to have seen the lights of other cars. However, when they made radio contact with these other travelers, they got answers in reversed voices that sounded like machines. 8:14 a.m. What would be the convoy's last unambiguous transmission was sent by Jessica Walsh. "This is Truck 3 with the emergency upgrade, base station. Even though our odometers are no longer moving forward, we are still using gasoline at our usual rates. Our chronometers tell us that we are traveling the same highway over and over again, passing the same landmarks every 12 minutes. Above us, the sky is clear, and the dust storm has encircled our caravan like a perfect cylinder. However, the storm's walls stretch in all directions indefinitely." Carlos Herrera made the last transmission at 8:21 a.m. His voice could hardly be heard over the growing static. "Convoy commander at the base station reporting final position. The dust is starting to dissipate, and we can see sunlight up ahead. The terrain has altered, but we're getting close to what looks to be our old path." There is a problem with our trucks. The highway markers are saying, wait, and the mountains are in different locations. Even if the engines are working, we are no longer moving. Base station, please answer. Are you able to hear us? Base station. After 8:21 a.m., M lost all radio communication with the convoy. The truck was in an area of the Atacama Desert, where the terrain was too rugged for heavy vehicle movement, according to the GPS tracking system's final known positions. The dust storm that the drivers had reported was not visible on satellite photography of the area, and weather monitoring stations across the area had not detected any unusual atmospheric activity when the convoy reported coming into contact with the storm. The area where the convoy's GPS signals were last detected was searched by emergency response teams promptly deployed in helicopters and all-terrain vehicles. Over 2,000 square miles of desert were searched over the course of 72 hours, but neither the missing vehicles nor their workers could be located. According to the search personnel, the local terrain was wholly inappropriate for huge mining vehicles to operate, consisting of rocky outcroppings and deep ravines that would have made it difficult for the convoy to have reached those coordinates. An unexplainable discovery was found by a ground search team 3 days following the disappearance. They discovered 3 sets of tire tracks embedded in solid rock formations that geological assessments revealed were millions of years old, precisely where the convoy's GPS signals had last been logged. The rock formations revealed no signs of recent disturbance or alteration, yet the tire impressions were in great condition and matched the specs of the vanished Caterpillar 797F trucks. The finding of what looked like melted metal pieces strewn all over the tire impressions was even more unsettling. According to laboratory investigation, the metal shards contained alloys that were compatible with the design of communication devices and mining truck lamps. However, there were indications that the pieces had been exposed to temperatures beyond 3,000 degrees EF, which is much greater than what could be produced in a desert environment. The analysis of the tire tracks themselves provided the most disturbing proof. The impressions were formed by vehicles carrying cargo that were 3 times heavier than the missing truck's physical capability, according to forensic examination. When the impressions were taken, the depth and compression patterns indicated that each truck had been transporting more than 120 tons of material, even though when they left the mine, the convoy had only been loaded with 40 tons each truck. Reports of phantom radio delayed mining activities in the Atacama Desert 6 months after the disappearance. Communications on the same frequencies that the convoy that went missing was using. The messages were from coordinates that put the convoy hundreds of miles away from any known highways or mining sites, yet several mining enterprises claim to have heard Carlos Herrera's voice asking for help and reporting their location. The voices, which described ongoing efforts to make their way through dust storms and arrive to their planned destination, were consistently frantic and distinct. After reviewing the case, atmospheric scientists came to the conclusion that no known propagation phenomenon could account for the radio emissions. The signals seemed to come from certain geographic locations, but they did not weaken with distance, pointing to a source of transmission that defied fundamental laws of radio wave physics. The most unsettling aspect was that the broadcasts consistently lasted precisely 17 minutes, which is the same amount of time as the convoy's initial distress communications. Regarding historical reports of strange occurrences in the Atacama Desert, local indigenous people were consulted. Vanished. Elders from the tribe told tales that had been passed down through the generations about locations in the desert where time seemed to move differently and where visitors might get lost in the moment. These conventional narratives suggested that specific atmospheric circumstances might open portals between various representations of the same terrain, enabling humans to enter locations that coexisted with but were distinct from the everyday reality. The mining cooperative ultimately halted operations along that portion of Route Shinko, stating that ongoing use of the route was not economically viable due to safety issues and equipment losses. However, encounters with a convoy of 3 enormous vehicles moving through dust storms that come and go without any meteorological explanation are still being reported by independent truck drivers and mining companies. Witnesses report witnessing the truck's headlights passing through dust clouds that appear to follow geometric patterns rather than the dynamics of the natural wind. These sightings invariably take place in the early morning hours. although no bodies were ever recovered and no wreckage was ever discovered. The case is still officially categorized as an industrial disaster involving equipment failure and crew casualties. Despite fruitless attempts to collect samples for additional examination, the tire prints in the ancient rock formations have been preserved as a research site, as though existing in a dimension distinct from the apparatus used to record them. The impressions seem to be visible only when viewed up close, vanishing from photographs and three-dimensional scans. The relatives of Carlos Herrera continues to be paid by the mining consortium, automatically deposited in accordance with business rules for unaccounted-for personnel whose status is still unknown. He regularly takes money out of his bank account to buy food and petrol. All were shot in the Atacama Desert near Rutachenko, implying that somewhere in the wide nothingness of one of the most hostile environments on Earth. The caravan keeps on indefinitely, possibly to a place that only endlessly attempting to finish. A delivery that was cut short by a dust storm that adhered to regulations only the desert itself knew. Let's go on to the 11th story. On September 22, 2023, a tour bus traveling along California Route 190, the primary roadway that passes through the center of one of the most hostile ecosystems in North America, sent an automatic distress signal to Death Valley National Park rangers. The GPS beacon that sent the signal was owned by Desert Adventures Tours, a respectable business that had been leading Death Valley tours for more than 15 years without experiencing any significant problems. When park rangers went to the distress call, they found what would turn out to be the most well-documented and unexplainable instance in the National Park Service's history, challenging their preconceived notions about the physical rules governing even the most hostile environments on the planet. At 9:34, Ranger Patricia Williams received the emergency call while on her routine morning patrol along Route 190. A.M. The tour bus's onboard safety system had activated the automated distress signal, signaling that emergency procedures had been initiated and the vehicle had completely stopped. The bus was situated at mile marker 23, around 15 miles west of Furnace Creek, in a region notorious for its intense heat and total absence of natural shade or water sources, based on the GPS coordinates that the beacon sent. Williams went straight to the address given by the distress beacon, anticipating that there would be a tour bus with mechanical issues or passengers experiencing heat-related medical difficulties. The park administration had specific equipment and procedures for rescuing trapped tourists who miscalculated the deadly nature of the desert environment, as Death Valley was known for vehicle breakdowns brought on by the severe heat. Williams could see the tour bus ahead on the highway, its danger lights flashing in the desert glare as she got closer to mile marker 23. The bus looked like a typical 40-person motor coach run by Desert Adventures Tours. It was painted in their recognizable blue and white livery and had big windows that let in sweeping views of the desert. The car was correctly parked on the highway's right shoulder, and Williams could see that the engine was still running because the air conditioners on the roof and the heat shimmer coming from the exhaust pipe were both operating. Everything about the scene resembled a regular mechanical stop or passenger emergency. Williams parked her Ranger behind the tour bus and went to the front door, anticipating that the driver or tour leader would meet her and explain the problem. However, as she ascended the stairs into the bus, she came upon something that contradicted all of her presumptions about the circumstances. Although there were no people aboard the bus, their personal things were all in the same location as if the visitors had just disappeared in the middle of the trip. There was signs of recent occupation in every seat. Snacks that people had been eating during their trip, cameras, water bottles, guidebooks, sunglasses, and personal belongings were all around the cabin. Some of the cell phones were still showing ongoing text messages or social media posts that had been cut off in the middle of sentences, while others were plugged into charging outlets. Valuables like wallets and jewelry were left fully accessible, and purses and backpacks were left on seats or in overhead bins with their contents undisturbed. The fact that many of the personal belongings displayed evidence of having been left behind during particular activities added to the scene's unnerving quality. A pen was still resting across the page of a half-finished crossword puzzle, as though the person working on it had been interrupted in the middle of a word. A single bite had been bitten out of a sandwich on one of the seats, and a thermos of coffee was still warm to the touch. The bread is still soft and doesn't appear to have been exposed to the desert air for very long. After requesting backup, Williams started a methodical investigation of the bus in an attempt to find out what had happened to the crew and passengers. The keys were still in the ignition, the driver's seat was empty, and everything was functioning as it should. Williams saw that the tour guide's microphone was still attached to the bus's public address system, resting on the dashboard. It appeared to have been turned on when someone was giving commentary to the passengers. The bus's internal security camera system was found to have been filming during the incident, which was the most unsettling of all. Williams gained access to the digital recording system and discovered video that showed the last few minutes before the travelers vanished. However, what she observed contradicted every logical explanation she could think of. The recording's timestamp indicated that the trip continued as usual until precisely 9:31 a.m., when it was evident that all 37 guests and 2 crew members were seated, snapping pictures and listening to tour commentary through the windows. 9:32 a.m. A remarkable event occurred. After being kept at a comfortable 72 F by the air conditioning system, the bus's interior temperature abruptly fell to 47 F, as indicated by the environmental sensors. The change in temperature happened instantly, and consistent throughout the car, without the gradual cooling that would be anticipated from weather or mechanical breakdown. The video shows passengers scrambling for jackets in response to the abrupt drop in temperature and chatting among themselves about it. The tour guide, Maria Santos, is seen in the video trying to get in touch with the bus driver on the air conditioning issue, but she doesn't get a response from the front of the vehicle. 9:33 a.m. When Maria realized that driver Robert Chen was no longer behind the wheel. The security camera caught her look of bewilderment and mounting worry as she approached the driver's seat to look into the issue. No one was driving the bus, yet it was still traveling at the typical highway pace and staying in its lane. Several camera angles inside the bus captured the horrific details of what transpired next. At 9:34 a.m., passengers started to vanish, in a particular order, beginning at the back of the bus and proceeding row by row. Instantaneous disappearances occurred. A person was plainly seen in their seat 1 second, then they vanished completely, leaving their personal stuff behind, and then there was no sign of them, of how they got out of the car or where they went. According to the security footage, the remaining passengers were totally oblivious to the disappearance of their fellow companions. Those who stayed went about their daily lives as usual, talking to each other, snapping pictures, and gazing out windows as though nothing strange was going on. Those who stayed did not acknowledge that anyone was missing, even after individuals vanished from seats right next to other passengers. Maria Santos vanished at 9:34 a.m., making her the last person to go missing. Precisely 3 minutes after she initially became aware of the temperature dip. She is seen standing in the middle aisle in the last moments of the surveillance film, staring straight at one of the cameras with a horrified expression on her face. Her mouth is open as though she is screaming, but there is no sound on the audio recording. After that, she just vanished, leaving only her microphone and the empty bus that was moving on its own down Route 190. Even without a driver, the bus maintained excellent lane discipline for 3 more minutes after the final passenger vanished. When the bus eventually stopped at mile marker 23, the automatic distress beacon activated and the GPS tracking system recorded its position, allowing the vehicle's onboard computer systems to continue functioning normally. The security cameras captured the air conditioning, flashing hazard lights, and an empty car parked on the highway shoulder. Still operating, keeping the inside temperature at precisely 47 F. Williams realized that the disappearance of 39 people needed more resources than the Park Service could offer. So he called the FBI and Death Valley National Park headquarters right away. 4 hours later, the site was crowded with forensic experts, federal investigators, and tools to examine every part of the abandoned tour bus. The 6-month probe would involve several agencies and some of the most cutting-edge analytical methods that law enforcement may use. The bus showed no indications of technical sabotage, violence, or fighting, according to forensic investigation. There were no signs of bombs, dangerous chemicals, or any other material that may account for the disappearances, and all of the vehicle's systems were operating flawlessly. The most perplexing aspect was that there was no indication of the lengthy unattended travel times that the surveillance camera had recorded, and the bus's fuel consumption, odometer readings, and engine wear patterns were all consistent with regular operation. The investigation's main attention shifted to the temperature anomaly that the bus's environmental systems had registered. Experts in climate control concluded that the abrupt 25-degree reduction in temperature that had taken place throughout the car could not be explained mechanically. The exterior weather had been constant with no atmospheric events that could explain the temperature drop, and the air conditioning equipment was unable to produce such rapid cooling. The identities of all 39 missing people were verified by DNA analysis of the personal belongings left behind, but offered no hints as to what happened to them. If the passengers had just vanished from their seats, fingerprints, hair samples, and other biological evidence would have been right in their place. All personal things were still in the same locations as when their owners vanished, and there were no indications of any struggle or attempt to exit the car. One finding made by the FBI's technical analysis team gave the case even more impossibility. Electromagnetic field variations were captured by the bus's electronic equipment during the 3 minutes when passengers were going missing. The patterns of these field changes were similar to the signatures found in studies in high-energy physics. However, at such power levels, significantly more equipment would be needed than could be hidden or used in a desert. The finding that the security camera film had information that contradicted fundamental beliefs about the nature of recorded evidence was the most unsettling. Using sophisticated digital enhancement techniques, investigators examined the footage, frame by frame, and discovered that some of the clips featured persons who weren't listed on the tour bus passenger manifest. Although these extra persons were only seen in single frames, they seemed to be dressed in attire from various eras and appeared to be standing in the aisles or peering through windows. Using helicopters, the hunt for the missing passengers grew to encompass almost 1,000 square miles of Death Valley. Thermal imaging devices, search dogs, and ground crews. None of the 39 missing people were ever located, even after the park's most thorough search operation in history. Areas where their electronic equipment malfunctioned and zones where the temperature was much lower than the surrounding areas were among the unusual finds that the search teams reported seeing. However, these occurrences offered no hints as to what happened to the travelers who vanished. Due to lawsuits and insurance claims pertaining to the disappearances, Desert Adventures Tours was unable to continue operations and shut down 6 months after the occurrence. After being seized as proof, the tour bus itself was later the focus of scientific investigations by academic institutions and research centers that were curious about unexplained phenomena. Scientists found that the temperature inside the car stayed at precisely 47 degrees F, regardless of outside factors or initiatives to modify the climate control system. Officially, the case is still open, categorized as an unresolved. The relatives of those who vanished passengers are still looking for answers, and some have said they have received texts and phone calls from the phone numbers of the missing travelers, despite the fact that telecom providers maintain that the phones in question were local Shoshone tribe members who have been damaged or lost and are unable to make calls. When asked about the incident, elders related customary tales about locations in Death Valley where the line separating the world of spirits from the world of the living gets increasingly blurred. Based on these reports, sometimes, certain places and circumstances might open doors that let individuals enter different realities, willingly and occasionally without their awareness or approval. The elderly indicated that one of these doorways had been passed by the tour bus at a time when the spiritual energy of the desert was really powerful. Death Valley's Route 190 is still in place. Although the area is open to traffic, tour operators have mostly stayed away from it, was discovered. Sometimes independent travelers claim to have seen an empty tour bus parked beside the roadway. The air conditioner is operating and its hazard lights are flashing. However, these encounters are always fleeting, and the bus, when witnesses try to go close or take a picture of it, it vanishes. Park authorities are still looking into these claims, but have never been successful in finding the car or figuring out if these sightings are the original bus or a residual phenomenon of some sort. The case's most disturbing element might be the fact that it completely contradicts one of the most basic truths about the world. because individuals cannot just vanish without leaving behind some indication of their whereabouts. 39 people disappeared from a controlled setting in conditions that were carefully recorded using a variety of recording devices. However, no justification has ever been discovered. That can explain how they vanished within the established physics and biology rules. Every year, millions of tourists continue to flock to Death Valley, attracted by its bleak beauty and standing as one of the worst places on Earth. However, there is another mystery in the desert for those who are aware of the vacant tour bus. The potential for certain trips over this historic terrain may lead to locations outside of limits of the planet. We believe we know the locations where Desert Adventure's missing guests may be. It's possible that tourists are still passing through a death valley that only occurs in the intervals between heartbeats, ceaselessly attempting to finish a tour that was cut short by forces more ancient and potent than human understanding.